Chapter 591. Lin Fengting did not follow the master of Samsara Palace into the hall of the villa. He stood in the center of the manor. Subtle sword qi surrounded the inside and outside of the manor, locking onto every enemy that approached. The killing intent in the city filled the air and swept across the entire city. Unlike tribulation's concentration and emptiness, the chaotic murderous intent kept spreading with despair. The sword light danced in the city, and the sound of explosions was continuous. Countless buildings began to collapse. Samsara Palace, Beihai Core, Purgatory of Heaven Capital, Snow Country. People were dying with every passing second. Lin Fengting stood there quietly. He could sense that the sword qi in the city had already steadily surpassed him. It was the sword qi of a god. The entire Purgatory of Heaven Capital was moving forward with difficulty. It could even be said to be in a stalemate. Lin Fengting was in a daze. His eyes were pure and absent-minded, without the slightest bit of anger, jealousy, or resentment. There was only helplessness and confusion in the depths of his eyes. No one denied that he was a big shot in the dark world. But compared to Wang Tianzong in deity, such a Lin Fengting was too simple. The secluded Lin clan had avoided countless storms. He was at the headquarters of the Lin clan, and everywhere in the world. As long as he had a sword in his hand, he could protect the Lin clan. The life of the Lin clan did not have the shadow of a sword, only a carefree life. Lin Fengting rarely thought about anything, which was why he was at a loss. The 4 children who had practiced swordsmanship together since they were young, 4 children who supported each other, and were inseparable. They were young and ignorant. Yet they dared to stand shoulder to shoulder against the entire world. A young couple who advanced and retreated together, regardless of gains or losses. That beautiful period of time was so quiet, just like a road. As time passed, it slowly came to an end, revealing a cruelty that he still could not understand. That was the youth when they fell out and became enemies. It also represented the era of the dark world. God was enduring. The Sword Emperor was rising. Summer Solstice, who wanted to be a queen, lost all her edge. And he began to be neutral. Childhood, adolescence, youth, everything was getting further and further away. The grudges between youth and middle age were so long that they were almost forgotten. Their middle age began to quietly come to an end. As they were about to enter old age, everything erupted in the most ferocious way. Mormons. The final battle. It was a place of death. How ironic was that? Summer Solstice, who was determined to be the mother of the world when she was a girl and liked to pull Wang Tianzong's ears, had restrained all her sharpness and ignored the affairs of the world. Wang Tianzong, who had been silent and didn't like martial arts at first but had to pick up the long sword, had become the supreme sword emperor. When he was a child, he had outstanding aptitude and the strongest combat strength. When he played games, he always liked to play the role of God. Finally, he became a god. But he was already deserted by everyone. The teenager who liked to put his arm around Wang Tianzong's shoulder and called him Big Brother, talking about some messy things. How many years had passed in the blink of an eye? The teenager was about to enter old age, but at this moment, he was fighting against the edge of the Wang family of Beihai, step by step stained with blood. What about himself? He had been carefree and neutral all his life. At this moment, standing in this white fog, countless sword energies had locked onto a large number of elites from the Purgatory of Heaven Capital and the North Sea Legion. How ridiculous was that? He didn't know if everyone's life was a process of losing themselves. But the 4 of them had lost their sense of self. He has 3 friends. There are 2 brothers. Now all of them were enemies. Lin Fengting laughed miserably. He stood quietly in a thick white fog. The white fog floated and gently surrounded his body. That feeling was not loneliness. It was loneliness. The master of Samsara Palace finally showed a little fatigue when she walked into the hall and left Lin Fengting's sight. There was nothing wrong with her state. She had already known the message that Lin Fengting had just given her. Obviously, what really made her feel tired was her seemingly understated decision. Qin Weibai silently poured her a glass of water and sat beside her, not knowing what to say. Flaming Fire, who had restrained all her killing intent, seemed to have once again become the supermaster of Samsara Palace from the woman who could call herself the palace. She took a quick shower and was about to cook when she finally received the news of the internal investigation of Samsara Palace. Flaming Fire glanced at it casually and frowned slightly. She seemed to be a little hesitant. "Master," she called out softly with obvious hesitation. "Who is it?" the master of Samsara Palace asked. Her voice was calm and cold. At the most critical moment of the battle, a hidden code with extremely high authority directly entered the network hub of Samsara Palace and cut into the most critical intelligence exchange and summary system of Samsara Palace in an instant. Countless top-secret messages were exposed to others. A few hours after the incident, Qin Weibai realized that something was wrong. After rewriting that code, she forcibly cut off the connection with the other party. Now, judging from Li Tianlan's marching speed, it was very likely that Li Tianlan had temporarily mastered that code. It was almost an impossible miracle to defeat the 6 legions overnight and forcibly break through the defense line of more than 100,000 people with only 500 people. And miracles themselves were impossible things. The miracles that could happen were all assumed. Among the 6 legions that were defeated in Snow Country, no one knew how many spies that Samsara Palace had hidden for many years played a role in it. After these people were used, they would also enter the observation area of Samsara Palace. The master of Samsara Palace did not care about these. What she cared about was that it was too fast. Li Tianlan's marching speed was too fast. She did not want Li Tianlan to appear in Mormons. The hypnosis that had been rooted in Li Tianlan's mind many years ago was an extremely solid preventive means, but Li Tianlan woke up from that state. In the sudden outbreak of the war, the more than 100,000 troops of Snow Country invisibly became the second kind of prevention. The first kind was just a means. The second kind was the general trend. With no one around Li Tianlan for the time being, with only a few hundred people, under normal circumstances, even if Li Tianlan entered the invincible realm, or even if Lin Yuxian entered the invincible realm, it would be impossible to completely break through the defense line of the 6 legions. The spies of Samsara Palace buried in the 6 legions could also protect Li Tianlan's safety to the greatest extent and delay him on the road. If everything went well, even if Li Tianlan could finally get to Mormons, it would take at least 1 day and 1 night. 1 day and 1 night, everything would be completely over. The general trend could not be broken. But all the spies in the general trend had been changed. The appearance of that code gave Li Tianlan insight into a lot of information about Samsara Palace. So he gathered the elites and directly killed the marshals and core high-level officials of the 6 legions with the craziest power. In the chaos, he contacted the spies of Samsara Palace. The whole dark world knew that Qin Weibai was Li Tianlan's woman. The relationship between the two was extremely strange from the beginning. At the beginning, Qin Weibai, whose status was much higher than Li Tianlan's, did not have any strong side between the two. She was gentle, obedient, and a perfect little woman. But to the outside world, she was still the supreme will of Samsara Palace most of the time. Qin Weibai did not bother to explain anything to the spies of Samsara Palace. At most, she promised to ensure Li Tianlan's safety. Those spies had no reason not to cooperate with Li Tianlan. In the chaos of war, all kinds of chaotic orders were issued from the spies. The whole battlefield was constantly in temporary chaos. In the end, Li Tianlan led hundreds of people through the defense line of more than 100,000 troops. Everything was because of that code. Without that code, Li Tianlan could not have entered the central system prepared for him by Samsara Palace in advance. Without the intelligence of Samsara Palace and the cooperation of the spies, he could only keep dragging the 6 legions of Snow Country on the way. Samsara Palace Master did not have to make any decision now. That code destroyed everything. And the person with such authority must be a high-level official of Samsara Palace. Samsara Palace Master wanted to know who the traitor was. Flaming Fire hesitated, bit her lip and whispered, "It's military counselor." Samsara Palace Master suddenly fell silent. Human nature was capricious, but some people never changed. There were 12 super masters in Samsara Palace. Even if all 12 super masters betrayed her, even if Saint betrayed her, and even if Qin Weibai betrayed her, Samsara Palace Master would find it understandable, and even not surprised. But there were two people who would not. One was Flaming Fire. The second was Military Counselor. They could not betray her, and they would not betray her. But why Military Counselor? Samsara Palace Master clenched her fists subconsciously. After a long time she said blandly, "Contact him." Qin Weibai did not hesitate and took the notebook. But at present, when almost all communication was invalid, she rewrote a code and established a short contact with Military Counselor. 3 minutes. Qin Weibai said. On the other side of the video was a very exquisite room. But the sound insulation seemed to be ordinary. Chaotic voices came faintly, and there seemed to be some impassioned speech. Military Counselor appeared in front of Samsara Palace Master with his real face. He looked at Samsara Palace Master with calm eyes. Why? Samsara Palace Master looked at him and asked. Military Counselor knew what Samsara Palace Master was asking. He was silent for a while and said quietly, "At this time he should appear in front of you. What's the use of him coming at this time?" Samsara Palace Master's tone became stern. "It's good to have a look," Military Counselor said quietly, his voice persistent and paranoid. "Why?" The Master of Samsara Palace repeated the question she had asked at the beginning. "Because I'm a man." Military Counselor laughed and was very frank. Li Tianlan is also a man. A man knows a man's mind best. He is a man. At this time, even if he has to crawl, he will crawl to you. Otherwise, it will be too cruel to you and to him. We can bear it. Samsara Palace Master's voice sounded like she was venting. At this time, Military Counselor was no longer her subordinate, but more like a friend. They had always been friends. To be exact, you can bear it, but he can't. Military Counselor sighed and said, "After this battle, you must know whether to stay or leave. But I don't want the person I will assist in the future to become a walking dead." "Do you know?" Samsara Palace Master's voice was low. Military Counselor interrupted her directly. "You may have your decision, or it may be crueler. But you just said that you can bear it. I have done a lot for you these years. Now I have the right to be selfish for once. At this time, he must appear by your side. Otherwise he can't bear it, and neither can I." Military Counselor glanced at Samsara Palace Master, waved his hand, and hung up the phone. It was straightforward. Facing the black screen of the notebook, Samsara Palace Master didn't speak for a long time. Qin Weibai hesitated and said, "Take a break?" "Tianlan is coming," Samsara Palace Master said softly. Qin Weibai looked at Samsara Palace Master quietly. She hesitated for a long time and then tentatively said, "Do you want to change your clothes? Is this your compensation?" Samsara Palace Master looked at Qin Weibai with some sarcasm. Qin Weibai looked at her quietly. She didn't even dare to show a trace of sympathy and pity in her eyes. Samsara Palace Master withdrew her gaze, stood up and said coldly, "Take back your hypocrisy. I don't need it." She got up and went upstairs. She glanced out of the window when she passed by. The vast white fog was useless to her. Lin Fengting's figure was still standing there. The sword intent around him was getting fainter and fainter. There were more and more people around the manor. In a trance, there seemed to be a sigh. The vast white fog was moving. Lin Fengting's figure was moving. Countless sword energy flew and condensed in the manor. The sword energy turned into one figure after another. Chapter 592. The Master of Samsara Palace froze on the spot. The thick white mist was still spreading, gentle and soothing. Surrounded by the white mist, Lin Fengting had completely forgotten himself. An extremely vast calmness and indifference swept through the entire manor in an instant. Lin Yuxian stopped. In a short period of time, he seemed to have become a different person. He was no longer outstanding, nor was he carefree. He just stood there, ordinary and unremarkable. The greatest thing in the world was peace. For example, towering mountains, vast oceans, and even the blazing sun in the starry sky. Plain and indifferent, but eternal and unchanging. With Lin Fengting as the center, wisps of sword intent spread to every corner of the manor. Countless Lin Fengting walked in different directions. There were more and more sword wills, and so Lin Fengting became more and more numerous. Dozens, hundreds, and even thousands of them. Flaming Fire stood beside the master of Samsara Palace and watched this scene. Her body trembled slightly, and her scalp went numb. At this moment, Lin Fengting's sword qi was like the sea, vast and endless. The calm before him seemed to be an illusion. His sword qi moved, and it was enough to flatten the entire manor in an instant. Flaming Fire could not stop him. Under normal circumstances, the master of Samsara Palace could not stop him. This is... Flaming Fire's voice trembled slightly. The 24 moves of sword of the Li family and the Lin clan seem to come from the same source, but the former focuses on momentum, while the latter focuses on intent. They have similar paths but different directions, so they are equally matched. The master of Samsara Palace looked at Lin Fengting and said in a low voice, "All laws of nature, Taoism of nature, and sword principle of nature." He made a breakthrough. There was no surprise in her voice. Instead, there was a hint of relief. Nowadays, perhaps not many people in the entire dark world knew the stories of Lin Fengting, Wang Tianzong, Li Guangtu, and Summer Solstice when they were young. But she knew. Back then, none of the four of them were inferior to anyone else. Wang Tianzong could cross the line from the peak of the invincible realm to the chosen one. Divine power could cross it, so could Lin Fengting. The master of Samsara Palace was never worried about whether Lin Fengting could make a breakthrough or not. She only worried about whether Lin Fengting was willing to make a breakthrough or not. Now Lin Fengting had taken this step that should have been taken many years later. It was an understatement. The master of Samsara Palace had mixed feelings. It was only at this moment, at the final moment, that she clearly realized that everything was finally different. Flaming Fire looked at Lin Fengting outside the window, and remained silent for a long time. She had many identities in the Samsara Palace, but she only had one position for herself. The whole dark world knew that when the will of the master of Samsara Palace was silent, Qin Weibai was the highest will of the Samsara Palace. And the master of Samsara Palace was silent most of the time. In fact, Qin Weibai was the most important person in the Samsara Palace. The supermaster who followed Qin Weibai all the time was naturally the strongest supermaster in the Samsara Palace. This was a fact that could easily be deduced. But since Qin Weibai appeared, the light of the supermasters of Samsara Palace seemed to have been taken away by saint and military counselor. So many people subconsciously ignored Flaming Fire, who had been following Qin Weibai and was willing to be her bodyguard, maid and nanny. But the strongest was still the strongest. He was so strong that she had already entered the invincible realm. He was so strong that she could call herself the palace at certain times. So at this moment, looking at Lin Fengting in a subtle state, and feeling the sword intent around him, Flaming Fire could clearly distinguish the difference between the 24 moves of sword that she had practiced and Lin Fengting's sword energy. Her eyes were a little dazed. It was the morning of August 24th in Eastern Europe. Mormons, shrouded in the polar night, was deep. It seemed that in the never-ending war, the whole dark world was withering, incomplete, and being crushed by the boundless army. But this day should also be remembered by future generations. Because on the day when the old era ended, in the last madness, more and more people completely surpassed the peak of martial arts. Wang Tianzong, tribulation, Lin Fengting, deity Flaming Fire whispered softly, half-step chosen one. The chosen one is never a realm. It's just a name for the supreme combat capability in an era, so the term half-step chosen one is not accurate. The chosen one is supreme, and there will be no one who can match him. In their current state and the direction they see, this realm should be called supreme. The master of Samsara Palace opened the window and jumped out. She said calmly, "Congratulations, sir." Lin Fengting looked at her quietly. After a long time he smiled and said, "I should thank you, but now I don't want to say it." "Then don't say it." The master of Samsara Palace said quietly, "I don't need to be polite." She paused and continued, "And with your talent, you should have been able to take this step long ago, right? Are you unwilling? Or unwilling? It's not worth it." Lin Fengting looked a little lonely. The manor was shrouded in white mist. Compared with the city, the extremely exquisite manor seemed to be a world of its own. The sword energy between heaven and earth roared, and surged with Lin Fengting as the center. The figures in the manor were still increasing. The figures condensed by the sword energy were walking, killing, and destroying. Blood waves rose to the sky in the white mist. The purgatory of Heaven Capital, the Wang family of Beihai, and Snow Country. One by one, the elites fell in Lin Fengting's sword intent. The sword light flashed in the white mist. The sword light was so natural. There was no hesitation or helplessness anymore. There was only nature. Lin Fengting looked around quietly. His eyes finally fell on the master of Samsara Palace. Is this what you want? He asked slowly. Yes. The master of Samsara Palace answered frankly and without hesitation. Sir, you are too generous. But how can there be kindness in the chaos? If you can let go of some unnecessary fetters, I'm more than happy to do so. Lin Fengting shook his head, looked at the white mist in front of him, and said softly, I have no friends. His voice was extremely lonely. The master of Samsara Palace was silent for a moment and said, I've been gone for a long time. The killing around him continued. Lin Fengting was a little dispirited. He waved his hand and said softly, I'm not afraid of being laughed at. Until a few months ago, I never thought that I would break through the peak of the invincible realm and enter another new realm. Not only did I grasp it, but I didn't even think that Tianzong would break through. He said softly, looked at the white mist in front of him, and fell silent. I'm not talented. I'm lucky to have achieved what I have today. But you're different. You're different. In this era, you're all really amazing people. The glory of the past may not be weaker than that of today's Tianlan. With talent and luck, it's not difficult to take half a step forward. The master of Samsara Palace said slowly, It's more than not difficult. It's a matter of course. Lin Fengting laughed self-mockingly. After seeing the sword stroke that destroyed the headquarters of the Samsara Palace, I had a feeling that I could try to take a step forward at that time, but it was delayed until now. Now it seems that this is the perfect breakthrough. The master of Samsara Palace took over the conversation. Lin Fengting didn't look at her. He just reached out and touched the mist in front of him. The thick mist was very similar to the usual thick mist, but it was completely different. It was a vast expanse of white, leisurely and soothing, like the color from another world, misty and full of vitality. Lin Fengting looked at it for a long time and suddenly said, Just because of this? Is this what you and Great Master Wu Wei have been planning for years? This is the first stage. The master of Samsara Palace's voice was soft. It's really mysterious. Lin Fengting laughed with a complicated look in his eyes. Mysterious doesn't mean illusory, but another kind of existence. You're so wise. Have you ever thought that the peak of martial arts has been at the peak of the invincible realm for many years? But in the past 6 months, people at the peak of the invincible realm have begun to break through one by one. Wang Tianzong deity, tonight's tribulation, tonight's you. For people who are close to the chosen one realm have appeared in a row, and all of them happen to be related to Zhongzhou state. Haven't you ever thought about why? Lin Fengting was stunned. Although the Lin clan is in Europe, it has always paid attention to Zhongzhou state. The strongest branches of the Lin clan have contributed a lot when Zhongzhou state was in trouble in the past, and they did it without hesitation every time. That's why you can come and go freely in Zhongzhou state. Because in the eyes of Zhongzhou state, the Lin clan is one of us. As for deity, although he is in East Island now, all his ambitions and his past are in Zhongzhou state. No matter where the purgatory of Heaven Capital is, no matter what its name is, deity is always from Zhongzhou state. Wang Tianzong and Tribulation don't need to say anything more. The 4 of you are the top combat power in the dark world today, and all of you are related to Zhongzhou state. It's interesting, isn't it? Lin Fengting was silent. Of course it's because of the dragon vein. The master of Samsara Palace said softly, The dragon vein of Zhongzhou state is gathering again, and the luck is gathering again. This is the general trend. Enough luck and enough talent together are enough to help you break through the current realm. This is destiny. What does the first stage mean? Lin Fengting suddenly asked. It may be a little naive to say this. The so-called stage is actually the process. The master of Samsara Palace explained. Process? Lin Fengting was a little confused. It's the process. The master of Samsara Palace was silent for a while, then slowly said, Tianlan is now carrying the dragon vein of Zhongzhou state. The stronger Tianlan is, the stronger Zhongzhou state is. Your breakthrough has nothing to do with Tianlan, but it's related to the dragon vein. Really? Lin Fengting's eyes finally showed a touch of undisguised shock. He had heard about carrying the dragon vein, but he had never taken it seriously. To concentrate the luck of a country on one person. Lin Fengting knew metaphysics, and the Lin clan also had its own metaphysical grandmaster. But the metaphysical grandmaster of the Lin clan could never do this. It was like expecting a newborn baby to carry a bag of more than 200 kilograms of rice. It was totally a fantasy. If Great Master Wu Wei could really do this, then he was not a metaphysical grandmaster, but a god. Under normal circumstances, it can't be like this. The master of Samsara Palace said. But he met me, so he can. What she said was inexplicable. But Lin Fengting understood in an instant. He smiled bitterly without hiding and was lost in thought for a long time. Then he slowly said, "If this is true, what will happen in the end of this process?" Of course, the stronger Zhongzhou state is, the stronger Tianlan is. The master of Samsara Palace said calmly. Lin Fengting carefully thought over these words, and a touch of awe gradually appeared in his eyes. The stronger Tianlan was, the stronger Zhongzhou state was. The stronger Zhongzhou state was, the stronger Tianlan was. How could this be martial arts? Such a cycle was close to the way of heaven. It's incredible. Lin Fengting muttered to himself. In confusion, he suddenly asked subconsciously, "Does Tianzong know about this?" The stronger Li Tianlan was, the stronger Zhongzhou state was, and vice versa. If Li Tianlan died, what would happen to Zhongzhou state? Lin Fengting suddenly knew how Wang Tianzong felt when he heard the news. He knows. The master of Samsara Palace said. But he may not believe it. Even if he does, how can he be willing? How can Wang Tianzong be willing to fall behind others? You should remind him. Lin Fengting said seriously. It doesn't make sense. No matter how much I say, he won't believe it. Ambitious people are suspicious. The master of Samsara Palace smiled. It's absurd. Xian Xuanzi has been in the Wang family of Beihai for a long time. Wang Tianzong doesn't know my origin, so he will naturally think it's impossible. What can I say? He knew that Li Tianlan had the dragon vein. At first, he wanted to kill Li Tianlan and use Xian Xuanzi to seize the dragon vein for the Wang family of Beihai. He hasn't given up such a plan until now. But Xian Xuanzi is from the Samsara Palace. Lin Fengting said softly. Yeah. The master of Samsara Palace nodded. So if Tianlan really dies in Eastern Europe, the dragon vein will reappear. If it collapses, Xian Xuanzi will use all means to make the Wang family of Beihai fall into hell and be doomed eternally. Lin Fengting's heart shook. If the Wang family of Beihai was really doomed eternally, it would cause an uproar that would affect the whole world. Lin Fengting couldn't imagine what kind of scene it would be. You really are a lunatic. Lin Fengting sighed softly. The master of Samsara Palace was silent. After a long time, she said softly. In fact, I don't have much bad feelings for the Sword Emperor. She seemed to be recalling something and continued. There are not many men I like in my life. Tianlan is one, Huang Tu is one, you are one, and Wang Tianzong is also one. I respect and appreciate you, Mr. Wang. I admire and even fear Wang Tianzong, which has nothing to do with love. A man like him seems to do everything he should do, even take it for granted. From any point of view, he can be called a hero of his generation. To be honest, in some aspects, even Tianlan is not as good as him. Lin Fengting listened quietly and suddenly said, everything at present is not irreversible. It's already irreversible. The master of Samsara Palace shook her head and smiled. If he hesitated in the headquarters of the Samsara Palace that day like you, there might be some possibility, but he chose to take that step at the bottom of the sea. I'm not talking about the hatred of destroying the headquarters of the Samsara Palace, but the step from the peak of the invincible realm to the half-step Supreme Master. That step was too decisive. The stronger Zhongzhou state is, the stronger Tianlan is. The stronger Tianlan is, the stronger Zhongzhou state is. The Li family is far from recovering, and Tianlan is not completely rising. In today's Zhongzhou state, the Wang family of Beihai is the most powerful force with the strongest fate. Do you know what this means? Lin Fengting frowned and said nothing. This means that as Zhongzhou state becomes stronger, Wang Tianzong will inevitably break through and enter the real supreme realm. He will become the chosen one, the perfect chosen one. The master of Samsara Palace smiled softly, as if sighing. The chosen one is supreme. The chosen one was supreme. Naturally, he would not allow anyone to stand beside him. So everything tonight was already doomed. It had nothing to do with right or wrong, but it was irreversible. Lin Fengting suddenly wanted to drink. He reached out and flicked his fingers, condensed a crystal-clear water droplet in the air, and put it in his mouth. The cold and cool liquid was swallowed into his abdomen. His spirit was also slightly shaken. He looked at the master of Samsara Palace. The perfect chosen one? He asked. The master of Samsara Palace smiled. This is inevitable. With his character, he deserves the peak posture of sweeping the whole world. Indeed. Lin Fengting nodded. He deserves it. His tone gradually lowered. But you can't stop him, and you can't win. It's impossible to win. Even if you have that sword. Even if you have the sword formation of the 13 floors. Even if you have me, deity and tribulation by your side. You can't win against such a sword emperor. He paused and said softly, I really can't win. Yes. The master of Samsara Palace nodded. You can't win. What will happen if he wins? Lin Fengting asked. The master of Samsara Palace glanced at him. Lin Fengting could not see her expression through the silver mask. He could only see her eyes, deep and calm, as brilliant as the Milky Way. If he wins, then everything in the world has nothing to do with me. Lin Fengting was speechless for a moment. He reached out and flicked the water droplets in the air. After a long time, he laughed and said, That's right. No matter who wins or loses, if I have a chance in the future, when I see Sword Emperor, I will tell him that the master of Samsara Palace, who has always been proud and even overturned the whole dark world, has only 3 men in her life, and he is 1/3 of them. At that time he will be very honored, won't he? Lin Fengting said happily. At least I will be honored. In the distance, there were desperate and crazy roars. He was still thinking, and death was spreading. The master of Samsara Palace stood up non-committally and said, I'll leave you here, sir. Where are you going? Lin Fengting asked. The master of Samsara Palace's body stiffened for a moment, and then she said, To take a rest, and then, her voice was a little trembling. To stop Tianlan. Lin Fengting sighed softly. Do you still remember the promise between us? The master of Samsara Palace's tone was calm. I know what you're talking about. The Samsara Palace will be completely destroyed tonight. And Daybreak will be the new patriarch of the Lin clan. I didn't violate anything. Indeed. Lin Fengting nodded in agreement. It seems that you didn't violate anything. His eyes gradually became sharp. But is the new patriarch of the Lin clan really Qin Weibai in the future? Is the one following you really Qin Weibai? The master of Samsara Palace turned around little by little. Her eyes were completely inexplicable. If she is not Qin Weibai, who else can she be? Lin Fengting took a deep breath and turned to look in the direction of the manor villa. Qin Weibai, dressed in white, stood at the door. She was so proud, so perfect, so delicate, so cold. It was snowing in the sky, and the moon was in the clouds. Peerless beauty. Lin Fengting was speechless for a moment. After a long time he said reluctantly, I'm afraid she can't control the Lin clan. The master of Samsara Palace turned around again and said in a calm tone, She can control the new stream, whose believers are all over several countries, so she is naturally qualified to control the Lin clan. Chapter 593. As the largest and most bloated organization in the Dark World, the headquarters of the Polar Ground Alliance was located on a relatively flat glacier in the polar region. The headquarters was less than 300 miles away from Mormons, just out of the border of Snow Country. In the past many years, this glacier, which did not belong to any country in Eastern Europe and meant the Dark Plain in the language of Snow Country, was the center of all the dark forces in Snow Country. The collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance was too sudden. and its internal structure was so bloated that even if it collapsed vigorously, the speed of the Polar Ground Alliance's disintegration was still extremely slow. After the destruction of the Violet and Morton families, the remaining core figures of the two families went deep into the polar region and the Dark Plane as soon as possible. A large amount of wealth of the two families was taken away by them, and then some experts of the Eastern Church were recruited. In the case of Tyrant's disappearance, the two families re-stabilized the control of the Polar Ground Alliance in the shortest time. However, without strength, the control in name and interests was ultimately an illusion. While the remaining important figures of the Violet and Morton families were still dreaming of revenge, the news of Tyrant's return had spread throughout Eastern Europe. The violent vanguard had spread to every corner of Eastern Europe. Before the two families and the Polar Ground Alliance could react, Tyrant had entered the Dark Plane alone. An extremely bloody and violent suppression followed. 3 hours later, Tyrant, who had returned and recovered to his peak state, killed 21 Thundershocking Realm experts of the Polar Ground Alliance and slaughtered half of the remaining elite knights of the Eastern Church. Countless elites of the Polar Ground Alliance who chose to support the Violet and Morton families turned into corpses and minced meat in his hands. Ivy Violet, who used to be the third in the Violet family and could be regarded as the cousin of the president of Snow Country in terms of blood relationship, was broken by him. The old patriarch of the Morton family wanted to kneel down and beg for mercy. At the moment he knelt down, Tyrant had kicked his head away. Straightforward, bloody, violent, and ferocious. A conflict broke out between the elites who were still loyal to Tyrant and those who surrendered to the four families. The war and bloodshed lasted for a short period of time. 2 of the 4 families were destroyed, and the other 2 entered Zhongzhou state. Tyrant, who was completely free from the shackles, was extremely decisive. According to the information he obtained, he directly removed all the spies belonging to Rekvia and the Qin clan. In less than a few hours, Tyrant had become the only will in the Dark Plane. The elites of the Polar Ground Alliance that were still in the headquarters began to assemble. On the flattest part of the glacier, large armed transport helicopters of Snow Country were already in position. On the Dark Plains, densely packed figures were moving. They held weapons and carried killing intent. Target: Mormons. Tyrant sat on the throne in the middle of the Alliance Hall, looking out the window into the distance. His line of sight passed through the glaciers, and seemed to have seen the purgatory, where every step he took was made of flesh and blood. Tyrant was expressionless as he touched his wrist. He wore a dark red bracelet on his wrist, and a dazzling scarlet gem was embedded in the center of the bracelet, shining brightly. That was Tyrant's biggest trump card. Among the 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World, it was second only to the Human Emperor. Its shooting speed was the fastest, and its single-target lethality was not inferior to that of the Human Emperor. Formless grace. Tyrant's restless heart gradually calmed down. After the battle with the Master of Samsara Palace, he fell everywhere in Eastern Europe, and his state of mind was overturned. Now he had a vague sign of a breakthrough. If he took this small step forward, he would be closer to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he couldn't break through, he would be a little stronger than he used to be. In this state, he held the formless grace that had been fully charged. With the murderous weapon in hand, he would not be inferior to any expert at the peak of the invincible realm in terms of lethality or deterrence. The chaos was bloody, and the general trend was surging. Tyrant touched the formless grace, and once again confirmed a fact. He already had the qualification to decide the general trend. "Your Highness," the president called. An expert of the Polar Ground Alliance from the military of Snow Country walked quickly into the hall and respectfully handed the phone to Tyrant. Tyrant took it and said calmly, "Mr. President. How is the Dark Plains?" The president of Snow Country's tone was low. "I killed Ivy." Tyrant was silent for a while and said blandly, "Ivy Violet. She was one of the core members of the Violet family. Before it was destroyed, the reason why the Violet family was considered the first family in Eastern Europe by most people was that they had a huge influence in Snow Country. In the past 100 years, the Violet family had produced 4 presidents and 3 prime ministers of Snow Country. The current president of Snow Country was also from the Violet family. The president of Snow Country was silent for a moment and said blandly, "I see. How is the Dark Plains?" "Everything is under my control." Tyrant's voice was cruel and fierce. "My people are gathering. Within 3 hours, nearly 30,000 elites of the Dark Plains will enter Mormons. The winner will be us." In the low breathing sound, the voice of the president of Snow Country sounded. "Your Highness, you only have 2 hours. Okay." Tyrant hesitated for a moment before he made up his mind. 2 hours then. The president of Snow Country agreed. Although he was from the Violet family, he did not care about Ivy's life or death. As one of the longest-serving presidents in the history of Snow Country, President Jia-Delin's disagreement with the Violet family had become more and more serious in recent years. This was not because he was not a direct descendant of the Violet family, but because of the natural opposition between the ruler and the wealthy capital. The Violet family was too powerful in Snow Country. Such power was beneficial sometimes, but more often, the Violet family was like a blood-sucking tumor lying on the lifeline of Snow Country. President Jia-Delin was a very accomplished president of Snow Empire, but most of the time, he was still restrained by the Violet family. Once some of his measures, or in other words, were likely to violate the interests of the Violet family, he would immediately face tremendous pressure. If he did not violate the interests of the Violet family, Snow Empire could not achieve a real rise. The Violet family did not care about the so-called national economy, but this was something that Jia-Delin had to consider. The sudden destruction of the Violet family was a disaster that broke out abruptly for Snow Empire. Since the destruction of the Violet family, millions of people in Snow Empire had lost their jobs, and the declining economic strength had become increasingly depressed. This also made Jia-Delin see the essence of the Violet family more clearly. If this disaster could completely remove this tumor, Snow Empire, which had lost the Violet family, would seem to be greatly weakened, but the future would become more hopeful. On the other end of the phone, in the palace of Snow Country, President Jia-Delin shook his head and then said, "The situation in Mormons is very complicated. The Beihai Core, Samsara Palace, and Purgatory of Heaven Capital are all enemies, but when facing us, their positions are very consistent. At present, Mormons has lost 3 legions, full legions. Your Highness, you know what this means. This price is too heavy. I need your help." "I understand." Tyrant was silent for a while, then nodded. "I will speed up the gathering speed of the Polar Ground Alliance, and set off in the shortest time. 2 hours. I need at least 2 hours. The corner of Jia-Delin's mouth twitched, but he did not continue to embarrass Tyrant. Tyrant had suppressed the Polar Ground Alliance fast enough. After the bloody battle of internal strife, it would take time for the personnel to gather and recondense their combat effectiveness. 2 hours, indeed, could not be any less. Although this meant that Snow Country needed to fill in another legion, or even more people to fight for this time. "I can give you 2 hours, but you must be fast." Jia-Delin held the phone tightly, and his tone was almost a low roar. Tyrant did not say much, but simply and resolutely responded, "Snow Country will win." He hung up the phone and walked out of the hall of the Alliance. It was busy everywhere in his sight. There were more and more people in the Polar Ground Alliance. Tonight, even if Tyrant did not care about the title of the Chief Marshal of Snow Country, he had nearly 30,000 available elites on the Dark Plane. These were the elites of the Dark World. In the Dark World, the so-called elites had the clearest definition. The elites who had entered the 4 realms of martial arts and completely stabilized the ice-condensing realm were the real elites. Tyrant raised his palm with a bracelet and held it tightly. In the process of closing his palm, what he touched was not nothingness but power. Boundless power was in his hands. His strength, his army, his murderous weapon, they were all power. Tyrant looked into the distance with no expression. His eyes were a little dazed. He held the power that might overturn the general trend. At this moment, he thought of Snow Country, the Wang family of Beihai, the Samsara Palace, and the Polar Ground Alliance. These were like one road after another. Tyrant never found that he had so many choices now. He smiled a little self-deprecatingly, and thought of a sentence that the famous marshal of Zhongzhou State once said. A soldier had no choice. So he was now the chief marshal of Snow Country. But after all, he could not be regarded as a soldier. When he hung up the phone, the morning sun over the capital of Snow Country had begun to rise gradually. The summit of the countries that lasted for nearly a night was finally over. A night of bloodshed and turmoil. The war that broke out abruptly began to decline after the peak. The flames of war were still burning all over Eastern Europe, but there was a tendency to gradually extinguish. There were only two real main battlefields. From Snow Country to Reiki City. Mormons. At present, the battlefield from Snow Country to Reiki City had suffered unprecedented setbacks. The defeated troops of the 6 legions were continuously returning to Snow Country, and Mormons was also in a stalemate. These two core battlefields were all presided over by Snow Country, and Snow Country had suffered great losses as a result. But Jia Delin's expression was still calm. After ending the call with Tyrant, he seemed to be a lot more relieved. In this extremely long and turbulent night, it was Snow Country who initiated the war. The real beneficiaries were the other Eastern European countries in Snow Country's camp. Both the defeated and Snow Country suffered heavy losses. But if countries wanted to keep their interests, they had to help Snow Country. So after the meeting, the coalition forces of various countries had appeared on the road to Snow Country in a mighty manner. At present, there were no real experts in Eastern Europe except Tyrant. But they had enough troops. Hundreds of thousands. Millions of people pushed over together. Peak of the invincible realm? Half-step chosen one? There was a ferocious look in Jia Delin's eyes. Go to hell. He firmly believed that he would be the final winner, and that Snow Country could laugh to the end. Once this war ended, the whole of Eastern Europe would undergo earth-shaking changes. The countries in Snow Country's camp would unite around Snow Country. Without the restraint of Violet, Snow Country would get through the painful period of the war at the fastest speed, and then usher in the fastest development. Snow Country could even annex these countries that were standing beside Snow Country at this time, and form a new Snow Country Federation. During his term, he would lead Snow Country to the peak again, to compete with Zhongzhou State and Star State. Jia Delin's name would also be recorded in the annals of history forever. All of this was great. The president got up from his seat, and planned to enjoy today's breakfast. Bang! The hurried sound of the door being pushed open suddenly sounded. The secretary who had been by Jia Delin's side for many years staggered in. She was flustered and in a hurry, and her face was full of panic. Jia Delin's mood, which had just improved a little, immediately fell to the bottom. He liked his secretary very much and knew him very well. At present, the other party's performance did not mean that his psychological quality was poor. It could only mean that Snow Country must have encountered some special situations that were completely unexpected. What's wrong? Jia Delin asked. There was a hint of nervousness in his voice that he didn't even notice. Gone. The secretary was out of his wits. He looked at Jia Delin and seemed to want to say something, but he couldn't say anything for a while. He just kept repeating, gone, gone. What's gone? An indescribable uneasiness rose. Jia Delin suddenly held the secretary's shoulder and shook him hard. The secretary's body was soft and fell to the ground as he shook. The moment his body touched the ground, he seemed to come to his senses and suddenly sat up from the ground. His face was pale, and there was an obvious crying tone in his trembling voice. Mr. President, the Divine Shield Corps is gone. With an apocalyptic aura, his voice was crazy and a little hysterical, as if he was venting the fear in his heart. In less than 3 hours, the Divine Shield Corps is gone. Buzz. Jia Delin's mind went blank in an instant. His body swayed back and leaned against the wall. Divine Shield. He muttered to himself as if he was delirious. After a long time he suddenly jumped up and roared wildly. How is it possible? The Divine Shield Corps. My Divine Shield Corps. How is it possible? The secretary burst into tears and trembled all over. The Divine Shield Corps. This was the largest corps in Snow Country. Compared with the other corps of about 30,000 people, the Divine Shield Corps had nearly 200,000 elite soldiers. It was the largest, most complete, and most well-equipped super-comprehensive corps in Snow Country. The position of the Divine Shield Corps was the Border Corps. Nearly 200,000 troops were stationed on the border between Snow Country and Zhongzhou State. There were more than 15 generals and 2 marshals in the corps. Such a force was the core force to ensure the stability of half of Snow Country. Now the secretary said that this force, the Divine Shield Corps, was gone. What's gone? Jia Delin said in a trembling voice. It's Dongqing Wudi. The secretary cried and choked with sobs. Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, led the Black Dragon Army and directly crushed the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps. There were many bits and pieces of news. But Jia Delin could no longer hear it clearly. He could only remember the first few words in his mind. Dongqing Wudi. The whole world knew what it meant to meet Dongqing Wudi in the war. To be exact, it meant what it meant to meet Dongqing Wudi on the battlefield and be defeated. This was the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State. He was the most outstanding marshal in the world in recent decades, and also the marshal with the strongest killing intent. Those who are my enemies don't expect to keep their dignity. Those who are my enemies don't expect to survive. Those who are my enemies, I'll flatten you. I'll crush you. The murderous voice that once echoed throughout the dark world meant the same fact. Dongqing Wudi's corps did not leave anyone alive or captives. So the defeat of the Divine Shield Corps was not a retreat, but a death. It was gone. On the morning of August 24th, Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State and the executive minister of the army headquarters, appeared in the camp of the Black Dragon Army of the Border Control Corps. At 5:15, 80,000 elites of the Black Dragon Army gathered. Dongqing Wudi led the army to attack Snow Country in person. At 8:10, the defense line, composed of nearly 200,000 people of the Divine Shield Corps of Snow Country, was completely penetrated. Countless people of the Divine Shield Corps died in battle. At 8:40, after a short rest, the Black Dragon Army officially stepped into the border of Snow Country. At this time, the morale of the entire Zhongzhou State had been completely ignited, and the soldiers of Zhongzhou State that could sweep everything was ready to move. At 9:30, the border city of Snow Country, Moliai, fell. The Divine Shield Corps, which fled to Moliai City and had no time to breathe, was once again crushed and slaughtered. At 11 o'clock, Olai City fell. Nearly 4/5 of the nearly 200,000 troops of the Divine Shield Corps were killed in the morning. The military flag embroidered with a magic sword moved forward in Snow Country, sweeping everything before it. Dongqing Wudi was stained with blood. Since the beginning of the war, the military flag had been flying at the forefront of the Black Dragon Army, and Dongqing Wudi had been standing at the forefront. He did not retreat even half a step. At 1 o'clock, Enrich Castle, the Black Dragon Army, which had less than 60,000 people left, approached the city. Dongqing Wudi stood at the forefront and seemed to be integrated with the army of less than 60,000 behind him. He was invincible in the world. At this time, the president of Snow Country, Jia Delin, who had adjusted his mood, finally began to call Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi answered the phone, but he did not negotiate. There was no threat. Just like the Wang family of Beihai, the Sword Emperor was the emperor of martial arts, and he was the well-deserved god of massacre in the army. Therefore, facing the Snow Empire, he only gave a notice. I'll have tea with you in the palace of Snow Country within 24 hours. At 1:15, Enrich Castle fell. The Black Dragon Army, which had less than 60,000 people, was mighty. At this time, Li Tianlan just finished the last battle and officially entered Snow Country. 2 men, one big and one small. In different directions, they went to different places. He waved his army in Snow Country. He pointed his sword at Mormons. All this seemed to be just shocking today. However, as time passed, it would definitely become a new legend many years later. Chapter 594. A 10,000-word chapter. The sun was already shining brightly in Snow Country, but the sky inside the palace of Snow Country suddenly darkened. After cutting off the call with Dongqing Wudi, President Jia Delin's body had been trembling slightly, not knowing whether it was because of anger or fear. Wars were often caused by the momentary madness of madmen. Behind this madness, President Jia Delin also realized what kind of price he had to pay. But he didn't expect that the price he had to pay was already unbearable at the beginning of the war. Li Tianlan defeated the 6 legions of Snow Country overnight. This was an absolute shame for Snow Country. But in the chaos, Jia Delin could accept all this. After all, Li Tianlan could defeat 6 legions, but he might not be able to defeat 8. Even if he could defeat 8, what about 10? No one could deny the dominance of real masters and elites on the battlefield, just like no one could deny the role of high-tech weapons on the battlefield. But at the end of the day, war was a fight between people. On a real cruel battlefield, artillery, bullets, and everything else would be destroyed, and masters would fall. Large-scale wars were never the stage for masters in the dark world to show off their skills. A large number of soldiers was everything, and the only factor that could determine the outcome of a war. Jia Delin could also endure the stalemate and heavy losses of Mormons. Deity was very strong. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was very strong. The Samsara Palace was very strong. The Beihai Corps was very strong. But this was something they had expected. In the final analysis, the reason why Jia Delin dared to launch a war was that the return of Tyrant made up for the lack of top-notch combat capability of Snow Country. After adding this strongest link, Jia Delin was completely confident that the millions of troops of Snow Country would wipe out everything. And although this war was launched by Snow Country, it was far more than the participants. Nearly half of the countries in Eastern Europe, large and small, had already stood in the camp of Snow Country. It would only take one night, or even less than one night, to wipe out the powerful families that were similar to tumors in their own territories. Then they would form a coalition army and go straight to Mormons. So in this war, the army of Snow Country was endless, and it could be said to be in an invincible position. Jia Delin had no reason not to be confident. As for Zhongzhou State was indeed the most powerful country in the world today, but the Divine Shield Corps of Snow Country, with nearly 200,000 troops, was also an elite force second only to the polar bear. In Jia Delin's estimation, even if these nearly 200,000 troops were no match for the Black Dragon Army of the Border Control Corps of Zhongzhou State, it would not be difficult for them to form a solid defense line that the Black Dragon Army could not break in a short time. Zhongzhou State would also mobilize troops. The Divine Shield Army would eventually collapse. But this will take time. What Zhongzhou State lacked the most now was time. In Jia Delin's expectation, when Zhongzhou State gathered its army and broke through the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps, the final battle of Mormons should have already ended. At that time, he would lead the countless coalition forces of various countries to the south. The absolute advantage in numbers could completely make up for the gap in combat effectiveness. At that time, he might even be able to defeat the army of Zhongzhou State and force Zhongzhou State to lower its head and compromise. For example, he could take back part of the land that originally belonged to Zhongzhou State and now belonged to Zhongzhou State, but used to belong to Snow Country. For example, the territory that the Wang family of Beihai first developed, most of Beihai province, used to belong to Snow Country. Therefore, although President Jia Delin felt heartache for the current huge loss, he was still full of expectations for a better future. But he never expected that the biggest problem turned out to be the Divine Shield Corps, which should not have a problem the most. There were 120,000 people in the Black Dragon Army. Only 40,000 people stayed behind. 80,000 people rushed to the border of Snow Country. In just a few hours, they directly broke the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps. The two marshals of the Divine Shield Corps knew Snow Country very well. The failure of this battle was so straightforward that it stunned people. But the military could not find any dereliction of duty by the two marshals who died in the battle. There was no problem with the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps. There was no problem with the armaments, logistics, and morale. There was no problem with anything. The only problem was that the Black Dragon Army was too strong. There was no conspiracy. In the face of the defense line of nearly 200,000 people, the Black Dragon Army directly rushed up. After the meal, the defense line was forcibly smashed. Such a gap lay in pure strength and fighting desire. This was not a strategic mistake, but it was an extremely fatal oversight. It was not until this moment that the world discovered that the Border Control Corps was the most elite super-large comprehensive army of Zhongzhou State. This was true. The Thunderbolt Battalion was also the most elite army of the Border Control Corps. This was also true. But the Border Control Corps with Dongqing Wudi and the Border Control Corps without Dongqing Wudi were two completely different concepts. The Border Control Corps. The Dongqing Corps. The God of Massacre Corps. In the Border Control Corps, wherever Dongqing Wudi, the God of Massacre of Zhongzhou State, was the Thunderbolt Battalion. The attack was like fire. The momentum was like thunder, breaking the sky. The Divine Shield Corps was defeated all the way, and the Black Dragon Army kept rushing. By the time President Jia Delin talked to Dongqing Wudi, there were less than 60,000 people left of the 80,000 people of the Black Dragon Army, while the nearly 200,000 troops of the Divine Shield Corps were defeated, and now there were less than 20,000 people left. There were no prisoners. The death of some soldiers was not even a sacrifice. When the defeat was at its peak, what the losers would encounter was the most brutal slaughter. The defeat of the Divine Shield Corps also meant that the land of Snow Country thousands of miles in the direction of Zhongzhou State would become extremely empty, because several corps along the way had already sent troops to Mormons. And this empty distance was the distance from the border to Kamos, the capital of Snow Country. Along the way, Snow Country could barely gather tens of thousands of soldiers, but how could the Black Dragon Army care about such a small number? With Dongqing Wudi in charge, the Black Dragon Army was completely insufferably arrogant. Dongqing Wudi said that he would have tea with President Jia Delin in the palace of Snow Country within 24 hours. A distance of thousands of miles. Even if the tens of thousands of soldiers of the Black Dragon Army died, they would follow Dongqing Wudi to the palace of Snow Country. No one doubted this. So in less than an hour after the call, several top staff officers of the military of Snow Country had already arrived outside the palace. President Jia Delin gathered everyone together and held an impromptu meeting. The battle in Mormons was still in a stalemate. The plan to send troops into Reki City was almost aborted. In the rear, the Black Dragon Army was sweeping the land of Snow Country like a ferocious dragon, staining the land with blood all the way. The extremely serious situation made everyone completely realize that the situation was different. It was no longer a question of how much they could win at the cost. The name Dongqing Wudi now really meant the possibility of Snow Country's defeat in this war. President Jia Delin did not talk nonsense, nor was he in the mood to say anything else. So at the beginning of the meeting, he had already pulled out the battle map of Snow Country in the conference room. The northernmost part of the map, which represented the small area of Mormons, was completely crimson. At the border with Zhongzhou State, there was a large area of conspicuous crimson. Now the crimson was spreading toward the interior of Snow Country, and it was pointing to the capital, Kamos, in an almost straight line. Not far from the crimson region, there were clusters of light blue. These blue dots were moving slowly towards the north. Everyone. President Jia Delin's expression was extremely cold. This is what we are doing now. The battle in Mormons is still in a stalemate, and the combat capability of the Divine Shield Corps is lower than I imagined. The Black Dragon Army of the God of Massacre Corps has officially invaded our southern border. According to the speed of their march, it is not entirely impossible for Dongqing Wudi to have tea with me here 24 hours a day. If this becomes true, I believe that Dongqing Wudi will also go to chat with you after having tea with me. There was a commotion in the conference room. They were all the real big shots in the social class of Snow Country. With the destruction of the Violet family, the capital of Snow Country was temporarily blank. The palace of Snow Country concentrated its power, and their future would be better. At this time, they suddenly found that the war they started was likely to be attacked by others. Anyone would feel panic. So now is not the time to wrangle with each other. I need each of your suggestions. I hope that you can be responsible for your words, because every decision you make now concerns the future of the Snow Empire, and even the life and death of each of us. The commotion in the conference room gradually turned into an uproar. In the chaos, an old senior staff officer slapped the table and stood up. He said angrily, "The Divine Shield Corps is incompetent. If it weren't for them, how could we be so passive now? We must hold them accountable. I suggest that they be punished, and it must be." Before he could finish his words, President Jia Delin waved his hand and said, Come on, take General Longdemei out. I suddenly remembered that the 7th Legion needs a supervisor to go north to Mormons. General Longdemei is a suitable candidate. Let him go. The palace warriors in the conference room rushed over and helped the old staff officer. Longdemei's body stiffened, and his face instantly turned pale. No, you can't do this. The 7th Legion was one of the 2nd Legions launched by Snow Country. Now it was estimated that it had entered the position of Mormons. Letting him supervise the army in that cruel environment was almost tantamount to letting him die. President Jia Delin was expressionless. I don't want to hear any nonsense now. I just look at what's in front of me, understand? Deal with the Divine Shield Corps? All the senior officials died in battle, and there were less than 20,000 soldiers. Deal with them. Deal with who? Even if the Divine Shield Corps was dealt with, wouldn't Dongqing Wudi come? Bullsh*T advice. Get out, get to the front line. I don't need these useless nonsense. Nonsense. Understand. Longdemei struggled, and was dragged out by the palace warriors. In the silence, a middle-aged general stood up. He looked at Jia Delin's face and said cautiously, Maybe we can contact the United Nations and sanction Zhongzhou State. No one spoke. Judlin looked at him as if he was an idiot. How to sanction? He asked indifferently. In the current situation, other countries were eager to see the result of the fight between Zhongzhou State and Snow Country before intervening. The war had just begun. Although it was tragic, other countries were not fools. How could they intervene without a result? And even if those countries were really stupid and righteous once, how could they sanction Zhongzhou State? Zhongzhou State was now the most powerful superpower. How could such a country be sanctioned? War? No country was willing to go to war with Zhongzhou State. Economic sanctions? Every time the currency of Zhongzhou State appreciated or depreciated, it directly affected the economy of the world. The so-called sanctions were nothing more than a joke. The lieutenant general's face turned red. He sat down awkwardly and didn't speak anymore. Everyone was looking at the map. In fact, there was a relatively reliable way at present. It was just that no one had said it for the time being. The red area on the map was the area invaded by Dongqing Wudi, and the light red area was his marching route. Around, near, and not far from these areas, there were light blue areas, all of which were Snow Country's own legions. At a rough glance, there were at least 7 or 8 legions in those blue areas, which meant that 7 or 8 legions were rushing to Mormons at this time. If these 7 or 8 legions could stay to stop the defense line, there would be another army of more than 200,000 soldiers. In this way, there would be hope to stop Dongqing Wudi. Of course, this method was good. However, if more than 200,000 troops were detained at once, not to mention the impact on the morale of the army when it suddenly retreated on the way to the front line, how could Mormons make up for the lack of more than 200,000 troops? This question was very important, but it involved their own life and death. In fact, the victory or defeat of the war had already been decided. Therefore, there would always be people who would stand up and put forward such a suggestion. After all, this was the only feasible way. However, in such a situation, whoever stood up and said this first was admitting that he was afraid of death. It was okay to be afraid of death. But in the war, how could a soldier be afraid of death? This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Once he stood up this time, he would not be able to get his power and status in the future. There was silence. There was a long silence, until the shrill ringing of the phone was suddenly remembered. Jia Delin's arm trembled. He took the phone from the secretary and listened to it for a while. His eyes became colder and colder. He threw the phone on the desk in front of him and said in a cold tone, "The latest battle report shows that Rust City has fallen. The Divine Shield Corps," he paused and said with great bitterness and difficulty, "the whole army was wiped out." There was an uproar. The crimson-red area on the battle map once again spread forward a certain distance. The distance was actually very small. But Snow Country, which had the largest territory in the world, was actually not big on the map. This stretch of distance made everyone shudder with fear. How could it be so fast? In the uproar, a relatively young staff officer finally stood up. This young man, who should have had a great future in snow country, said calmly, "Mr. President, I suggest that we immediately transfer back the 7 corps in the area near Dongqing Wudi and form a line of defense to protect Kamas." His voice seemed steady, but it was trembling. No one despised this young man for being afraid of death. Everyone looked at him with gratitude. Jia Delin glanced at him and said in a dull tone, "What about Mormons?" "It's more important here," the young staff officer said quietly. "Important? What's important?" Jia Delin asked. He suddenly stood up and roared hysterically. "What's important here? Because this is the capital? Is there a palace here? If we lose this place, Snow Country will lose face?" Bulsh *T. An army of 200,000 people was wiped out in a few hours. F***CKU. Do you have face? Is this place more important than Mormons? If we fail in Mormons, do you idiots know what will happen to Snow Country? Stupid. Idiot. Incompetent. As he roared, everyone lowered their heads, not saying a word. Jia Delin gasped heavily and looked at the silent scene. After a long time, he suddenly laughed. "It seems that you idiots won't have a better suggestion, right?" It was quiet. Jia Delin nodded. "Then I have a better suggestion." He looked at the young staff officer who was still standing there and said calmly, "Vincent is right. Of course, the capital is important, but compared to Mormons, it's not that we can't compromise here. Even if we compromise, can we defeat Dongqing Wudi by detaining these 7 legions? Who has the confidence? Who has the confidence?" It was still quiet. Jia Delin continued to nod. "Look, we don't have the confidence to defeat Dongqing Wudi, but what if we change our perspective? Who has the confidence to defeat Wulon State?" Everyone raised their heads and looked stunned. Defeat Wulon State? The army of Wulon State was not strong. After the trial day and the date of death, Wulon State's military power and high-level officials suffered heavy losses. Too many people were sure to defeat Wulon State. "I won't admit defeat," Jia Delin said blandly. "So I want to bet with Dongqing Wudi. I believe that the army of Snow Country is a real elite. Give my order." He turned his head to look at the blue light spot on the map and pointed. "Let the 9th Corps and the 14th Corps stand by. Others continue to go to Mormons." Everyone looked at the screen. On the screen, the positions of the 9th Corps and the 14th Corps were extremely subtle. In everyone's speculation, Jia Delin grinned grimly. "President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State is in Reki City. As long as we take Reki City and capture the president of Zhongzhou State, do you think Dongqing Wudi will continue to march?" In the quiet conference room, a group of high-level officials looked at Jia Delin blankly. No one even objected. There was only one thought in their minds. Crazy. Jia Delin was completely crazy. Jia Delin looked at the map. On the map, the 2 corps he had left were only a few hundred miles away from Reki City, much shorter than the distance that Dongqing Wudi had traveled to the capital of Snow Country. Jia Delin nodded with satisfaction, looked at the crowd around him, and said blandly, "Who wants to go with me?" In the roar, everyone stood up. Not because everyone was willing to go, but because they were shocked. The meaning of this sentence couldn't be simpler. Jia Delin, the president of Snow Country, was going to attack Reki City in person when Dongqing Wudi marched to the capital. The cold wind blew from the barren polar region, bringing with it the broken ice and snow in the polar region. The cold chill seemed to contain endless malice, penetrating into every pore of the body. He walked quietly. It seemed that the war that would last forever had been left behind by him. The desperate shouts and roars of war gradually faded away. Silence enveloped the wilderness. In the empty world, it seemed that only the numb heartbeat was still going on, one beat after another. His heart was completely empty. The scene in front of him was extremely vague. His messy thoughts had become muddle-headed after the intense fluctuation. The numbness covered him with coldness, taking away the low temperature from his body. He could not feel the cold or the pain. When he moved forward, he could not feel any direction or future. It was empty. The whole world had become completely empty. In the deep darkness of the polar night, he staggered and stumbled in the desolate wilderness, like a walking corpse that had completely lost its soul. He didn't know where he was going, what he was doing, or even who he was. The pain in his heart had long since disappeared. His empty thoughts were completely desolate. The obsessions of the past years, whether they were expectations, bitterness, or hatred, all had a meaning of existence after all. But after all the obsessions were completely gone tonight, the so-called world, the so-called everything, seemed to have completely become nothingness. Wherever I went, I would die. Who am I? It didn't matter. The earth began to shake. Flags appeared in the dark and deep night. A dense army surged in front of him. The main battle tanks, which looked like ferocious beasts, opened the way in front. Behind them, military trucks full of troops galloped forward. The army was vast and occupied almost all of his field of vision. He seemed to be unaware of it and walked forward numbly. The barrel of the main battle tank aimed at his body for the first time. In the command room in the center of the truck fleet, his figure also appeared on the screen in front of the general of the Eisen Federation. He was dressed in black, his face was pale, and his eyes were red and dull. Blood stained his black clothes, and a large area of his clothes had completely turned dark red. As he walked, wisps of blood seemed to come out from all over his body. He ignored it and just walked forward, incomparably stupefied. This was an Easterner. The general easily made a judgment. Then he grinned grimly. Tonight, in Eastern Europe at this moment, any Easterner who was stained with blood had only one end. The general picked up the walkie-talkie in front of the battle map and sneered. It's a thug from Zhongzhou state. Open fire and kill him. The muzzle of the main battle tank in front of him turned, and the dark muzzle carried a clear sense of death. The general looked at the cruel scene that was about to happen with interest and muttered to himself, "These bastards should all be killed." The cannons of the main battle tanks were about to roar. The general suddenly changed his mind. "Wait," he suddenly said. "No need to open fire. Just run over and crush him directly into meat paste." His eyes were filled with killing intent and extremely wild. The roar of the tank continued to move forward. The vast army rolled over bit by bit. The two sides were getting closer and closer. He was still walking forward without changing his route, and even his expression had not changed slightly. Countless people in the first batch of troops from the Eisen Federation, who entered Snow Country, were watching this scene. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. 100 meters. 50 meters. 20 meters. His eyes had no focus at all. He just moved forward numbly and didn't care about the impending death. The incomparably tall tank rolled over with a rumble with a shadow. 5 meters. Keep moving forward. In the next second, the entire army heard an incomparably clear sound of something being sliced apart. Crack. It was a crisp and clear sound. It was like the sound of an extremely sharp blade cutting into metal in an instant, clear and crisp, without the slightest sense of stagnation. In the line of sight of the Eisen Federation's general, the huge main battle tank at the very front suddenly trembled. A smear of scarlet red rushed into the sky like a fountain. The huge cannon barrel flew up, and the tank stopped. The thick armor seemed to have been cut in half from the middle in an instant. The cannonball inside the tank suddenly exploded, and a large area of fire engulfed the nearby armored vehicles. The roaring sound occupied the entire vision, and the raging fire burned. Only the clear and crisp cutting sound was still ringing. The general blinked his eyes. He didn't feel angry or frightened. What happened in this instant almost violated all his common sense, so he just felt a little absurd, and even suspected that he was hallucinating because he was too nervous about the coming battle. Explosions and raging fire burned in the army. The entire army was dead silent and looked extremely sluggish. In the fire that almost burned the night sky, the numb and stiff figure walked out. He staggered forward like a walking corpse, and cyclones seemed to be condensing around him by instinct. There were more and more cyclones, and then they continued to elongate, turning into tangible and invisible sharp blades. Thousands of sharp blades danced in front of him, spreading to the entire army. As he moved forward, countless sharp blades cut in between the heaven and the earth with incomparable stability. It was a sharp edge that looked fragile but was extremely fierce and sharp to the extreme. Tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, weapons, armor, flesh and blood. As he moved forward, everything in front of him was directly cut apart. Blood, wreckage, and explosions were everywhere. The entire army stopped. The general finally reacted from this nightmarish scene. He picked up the walkie-talkie and loudly ordered the army to start charging, while he rushed out of the truck without hesitation and began to flee in the direction he came from. The sharp blade that filled the space between the heaven and the earth slowly moved forward. All the charges were incomparably futile. The blood wave that rose into the sky was not fast or slow, but it moved forward with incomparable firmness as he moved forward. In less than 15 minutes, the raging fire was still burning. The wilderness became wilderness again. The explosions and gunshots stopped. Countless corpses that were directly cut in two fell to the ground with blood and the wreckage of armaments, densely covering the entire wilderness. He seemed to not know what he had done and walked forward in a daze. He passed the battlefield full of corpses, walked through the wilderness, and passed through the incomparably deserted city. His figure was getting faster and faster unknowingly. The icy wind of the polar region blew over, with a temperature of despair and deathly stillness, enveloping the entire world. The sound of surging waves in front of him faintly came over. It was getting closer and closer. A huge roar sounded on the sea level. A huge warship with an incomparably huge silhouette appeared in his field of vision and sailed into the distance. He walked from the land to the sea. Under the dark sky, the howling wolves that were surging with the icy wind suddenly became silent. The vast ocean within a radius of a kilometer suddenly became lifeless, stagnant water. The rising murderous intent swept across the bottom of the sea unconsciously. Fish and shrimp, seaweed, shells, reefs, ice. This chapter is not over, please turn the page. Everything was completely cut apart. The vast ocean without the slightest fluctuation gradually turned red. He stepped on the surface of the water and approached the sea. The warship was still moving forward. The lights were dazzling, illuminating the world. It was unknown which country's fleet it belonged to. All the armed personnel were on standby. Their direction was the only military port in Mormons. Judging from the scale, it was a whole fleet. The night and the black clothes merged into one. The sea was stagnant. He walked quietly on the sea for dozens of miles. Along the way, all the creatures in the sea were completely cut by invisible sharp blades, and the blood had dyed the sea red. He stepped on the red seawater and walked toward the fleet. An earth-shattering sound broke out in the vast ocean. The raging fire began to burn on the sea, illuminating the sky. The huge wreckage of the warship sank to the bottom of the sea with countless corpses. The fire, the explosion, and all the ripples were suppressed by the invisible force in an instant. The battlefield disappeared. He stood on the dead sea, watching the blood spread in the water, feeling lost and desperate. In front of him was the boundless ocean, more than thousands of miles long. Behind him was darkness, and there was no way back. In a trance, he seemed to think of the North Island many years ago. He stood on the coastline of the North Island and looked at Mount Dibbing across the sea. She walked under the falling cherry trees. Her eyes were brighter than the evening sunset. The assassin and the Holy Virgin. The cherry blossoms and the sea. His figure was a little shaky, and all his strength began to decline slowly, bit by bit. But the killing intent that was condensed to the extreme began to rise. He felt the pain, and his will gradually became sober. His firm will flickered. He thought of his life, from childhood to adulthood, many people, many things, countless life and death, and countless separations. He thought of Situt Songyua, Li Kwangtu, the high spirits when he was young and frivolous, the picturesque rivers and mountains on Mount Dibbing, and the white snow on Mount Taibai, the cherry blossoms on the North Island, the vast sea, and the solemn trial. Pictures flashed in his mind one after another. He looked at the flowers on horseback. He thought of Angel again. The holy land of Italos. All the pictures began to dim and disappear. He suddenly realized that what he remembered most in his life was not Angel. It was not a long time, because it was less than a lifetime. It was not a short time, because he had never died young. What he remembered most clearly was the scene of being separated from Angel, and being thrown out of the Holy Land like a dog until today. It was anger, unwillingness, longing, concern, and care. For so many years, all his emotions were obsession. He became stronger at all costs. The only thing he wanted to do was to go to the Holy Land again and bring his woman back. Tribulation. It was obsession in itself. He stood on the sea, and his eyes were burning. That was the raging fire of Mormons. Countless saint warriors were gathering. Her body was nailed to the cross. Blood flowed and floated in the air. The fire was burning, twisting the air. That was the last time. He did not see her face clearly. Her expression. In the space distorted by the fire, the last time. The only thing he could touch was the vast will. She turned into ashes in the raging fire all over the sky, and the dust drifted all over the sky. She did not even leave a word. They met again after so many years. If she could speak, what would she say? What did she want to say? What else could he say? He thought quietly and finally understood that no matter what she would say, it was no longer important. Because she was gone. He began to cry again. Standing on the vast sea, surrounded by the vast and silent ocean, the night fell and merged with the black seawater. The murderous aura continued to spread. It was not until this moment that he really realized that he really had nothing left. He stood quietly, no longer moving forward, no longer pursuing, as if he would stand until the end of time, until a voice sounded in his ear. It was peaceful, indifferent, calm, and casual. This low voice easily pierced through his killing intent and appeared in his ears. "Are you waiting for me?" He did not respond. The voice sounded again. "Can you stop me?" He raised his head and looked ahead. Wang Tianzong, in a black costume and carrying a huge sword, walked over from the sea. He crossed the mountains, walked across the plains, and crossed the sea. 1,000 miles were behind him, but he was not tired at all. Instead, his spirit became more and more vigorous. Tribulation's eyes were a little confused, and his voice was hoarse. "She is dead." Wang Tianzong was stunned and then fell silent. It didn't matter who Tribulation was talking about. What mattered was that there was only despair and emptiness in his tone. He could not understand such a feeling, but more than 20 years ago, at a certain moment he felt the same way. Wang Tianzong looked at Tribulation and felt his rising and completely out of control killing intent. His state was declining, but the condensed killing intent with endless sharpness had broken through the scope of the half-step chosen one, and truly reached the supreme domain. His eyes were a little emotional. When he was young, Tribulation had been with him for a while. At that time, he and Li Kuangtu were still brothers. He and Tribulation were not friends. But Li Kuangtu and Situt Songyue's younger brother was also his younger brother at that time. Wang Tianzong thought quietly. At that time, Wang Xiaoyao seemed to have a good relationship with Tribulation. He was also optimistic about Tribulation's future. But he had never thought that when he was at his strongest, the strongest opponent he met in his life turned out to be Tribulation. Tribulation stood in front of him on the sea. In front of him was his path. "I can understand your mood," Wang Tianzong said slowly. His words were a little pale. Tribulation looked at him blankly, with only confusion. Wang Tianzong was silent for a long time before he said again. "Where do you want to go? I'll send you." "You?" Tribulation looked at him and smiled bitterly. "You want to send me? Is there anyone else who can send me?" "I can," Wang Tianzong said lightly. Tribulation's smile grew bigger and bigger, but also more and more bleak. The last tear flowed through his eyes and down his cheek. Falling. He opened his mouth softly and said vaguely and hoarsely, "Okay." Wang Tianzong's eyes gradually burned and were extremely bright. His voice sounded clear and faint. "Have a good trip." Tears fell into the vast sea. Ripples appeared on the still surface of the water. The ripples spread out. Under the dark sky, the whole sea area roared wildly in an instant. Monstrous waves rushed to the sky thousands of meters high in an instant, and water drops with sword intent covered the sky. Tribulation let go of everything and rushed directly to Wang Tianzong. The space was completely shattered by the killing intent. Light and shadow suddenly lit up in the endless darkness and silence. Tribulation's martial arts began to collapse. All his strength retreated to the chi-controlling realm, and then rose wildly. Ice-condensing realm, fire-flaming realm, thunder-shocking realm. He entered the invincible realm in an instant. The peak of the invincible realm. Half-step chosen one. Supremacy. An unprecedented glory and pinnacle gathered on his body. Monstrous waves surged and gathered as he rose. Tribulation opened his hands. At this moment he held almost the entire Arctic Ocean in his hands. In the shortest time, the huge wave rushed across the sky of tens of thousands of meters, like a roaring gathering rising from the sea. With condensed sword intent, it broke through the space, devoured the void, and directly arrived in front of Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong pulled out the huge sword behind him. Coldness of 9 states. Buzz. A clear sound suddenly rang out between the sky and the sea. The black huge sword appeared clearly in Tribulation's sight through the huge waves tens of thousands of meters away. Everything engraved on the blade seemed to light up. The sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, and everything in the world. They were all reincarnated. They were all one sword. This sword was here. Wang Tianzong's figure seemed to be standing in another world. He pulled out the sword in another world. The sun and moon were above his head, and the rivers, lakes, and seas were all trembling. That was the most essential sword. A simple, pure sword. The sharpness that filled the world gathered on the sword edge, smashing the night sky and tearing the huge waves. The sword energy kept filling his eyes. It was extremely real, but also extremely illusory. Light and darkness were constantly alternating in this sword. Between day and night, the extremely explosive sword energy instantly arrived in front of Tribulation. Boom! In the extremely loud roar, the sea surface tens of thousands of meters around suddenly sank. There seemed to be a scorching sun in the dark night sky. It was illusory and real. The sun, moon, and stars were all sword light. The sea area tens of thousands of meters turned into a huge vortex under the completely boiling sword energy. The vortex kept spinning on the sea level, and every drop of water carried the alternating light and darkness of the sword light. The most perfect sword intent. The most extreme outbreak. 6 paths of reincarnation sword. The coldness of 9 states, which was used with all its strength for the first time, trembled slightly with extremely clear excitement. Wang Tianzong stood in the sky and looked down at the sea area. There were no huge waves in the sea area, and there was no tribulation. Only the vortex was left. Only the ocean was left. His body moved and slowly withdrew the sword. A faint sound came. He lowered his head. A gash appeared in his hand, bringing with it fresh blood. The blood flowed into the coldness of 9 states and was absorbed by the sword. Wang Tianzong looked at his palm. After a long time he raised it gently. He raised his arm little by little. The process was very slow. With his movement, there were countless cracks on his palms, wrists, legs, face, and almost every part of his body. The sharpness tore his skin. In an instant, Wang Tianzong was covered in blood. He put the coldness of 9 states behind him again. Wang Tianzong's figure in the sky suddenly fell down, and a large mouthful of blood instantly sprayed out. His face was pale, but he was laughing, extremely comfortable. His body fell in the center of the vortex in the sea and he opened his hands. At this moment, between the sky and the sea, everything revolved around him and was in the palm of his hand. The emblem of the Wang family of Beihai was the sky and the sea. And today, August 24th, between the sky and the sea, Wang Tianzong finally crossed the boundary and made up for all his imperfections. In the final outbreak of tribulation, he officially entered the supreme realm. Moreover, flawless. Wang Tianzong closed his eyes. The loud and vigorous heartbeat swept through the waves and resounded through the world. All the wounds on his body began to heal. His aura was completely stable, far better than before. With the endless sword intent, like a whirlpool of reincarnation, he disappeared on the sea level. Wang Tianzong turned around. Across the sea and the mountains, he looked at Mormons, who was getting closer and closer to him. The city that had become a purgatory was everything he wanted to conquer. "I'm coming," he whispered. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 595. The reason why lunatics were called lunatics was because they dared to do it, could do it, and were willing to do things that ordinary people would not even consider. Countless histories had clearly shown one truth. There was only half a step between insanity and stupidity, and similarly, There was only half a step between insanity and wisdom. The flames of war filled the air, and smoke was everywhere. The turmoil that was enough to topple all of Eastern Europe continued to spread. As the longest-serving president in the history of Snow Empire, as the initiator of this war that was enough to be recorded in the history books, when the higher-ups of Snow Empire were considering life and death, Jia Delin only considered success or failure. Dongqing Wudi commanded his army to go north, and his sword pointed straight at Kamas. The situation was so clear. The Black Dragon army unreservedly vented their sharpness and combat power in Snow Country, telling the world their terrifying combat power. There were several legions of Snow Country along the way from the border to Kamas, but no one could guarantee that these legions could stop Dongqing Wudi. Moreover, leaving these legions was equivalent to compromising with Mormon's battle situation. No one could predict the consequences, and no one could bear the responsibility. Jia Delin thought that this war was the best time for him to get his hands on enough chips. To put it bluntly, he couldn't afford to lose in the face of variables. Dongqing Wudi was unstoppable. The only thing he could do was to fight for time. If he couldn't beat Dongqing Wudi, he would race against time with him. The strong and iron-blooded order was directly issued to all military bases in Snow Country as soon as the meeting ended. Almost all the fighter jets that could be on standby received specific orders. Snow Country's satellites and radars began to monitor all of Eastern Europe. Snow Country, which claimed to have the largest spy network in the world, launched all the spies and agents, and the follow-up means were turned over one by one. Blocking the airspace of Eastern Europe. Blockade the land of Eastern Europe. Immediately, the huge naval fleet of Snow Country began to set out to sea. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State was in Reki City. Since he wanted to compete with Dongqing Wudi for the world, he must ensure that Li Huaqing could not leave Eastern Europe. Only in this way could all this make sense. In the process of conveying all the orders, the president of Snow Country, Jia Delin, had already flown directly to the encampment of the 7th Corps and the 14th Corps by helicopter. When Dongqing Wudi wanted to defeat Kamas, the president of Snow Country, Jia Delin, had already begun to carry out the plan to capture Li Huaqing alive without hesitation. Everything was moving forward. Life and death, victory and defeat, there was no turning back. Jia Delin knew very well what this battle meant. It meant the fate of the Snow Empire, and it also meant his own future. In his heart, this was an equally important matter. Eastern Europe, August 24th afternoon. When Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, went more than 200 miles deep into Snow Country, President Jia Delin of Snow Country left the 7th and 14th Corps of Snow Country to conquer Wulan State. In the second hour, the 70,000-strong army encountered a division of the Arctic Ocean Command that had been scattered. The 70,000-strong army was like a ferocious tiger. In less than an hour, they annihilated the defeated soldiers of the Arctic Ocean Command, and then began to charge at full speed. The chaos had reached its peak. With the actions of Dongqing Wudi and Jia Delin, the entire international situation began to become complicated and tense. Reki City, Manlisai Hotel. The banquet, which had an incomparably grand beginning, but an incomparably chaotic process, continued. The resplendent hall was filled with soft music. One by one, the clan leaders who were still full of ambition yesterday, began to vent their negative emotions in the hall. Irritation, anger, resentment, fear, and even regret appeared on their faces. Everyone had already known the news of last night. After all, the blockade of Wulan State was not thorough enough. When the first clan leader of a wealthy family learned the news of the war in Eastern Europe, the bad news spread to the whole audience like a plague. Everyone was anxiously waiting for the news. However, after Wulan State learned its lesson, the news was blocked very well this time. All the clan leaders of the wealthy families present were almost under house arrest in the banquet hall. As time went by, the clan leaders of the wealthy families, who did not know the scale of the war for the time being, kept speculating about the news. Their moods also became more and more chaotic in the speculation, and then they lost their composure. At lunchtime, the hotel provided exquisite food. Wulan State was famous for its beauties all over the world. The waiters carefully selected by the hotel had the capital to make people's eyes light up. However, no matter for beauties or delicacies, these clan leaders were not in the mood to enjoy them now. After a clan leader of a wealthy family talked to a waiter with a smile, but did not get any useful reply, the clan leader, who was almost completely crushed by the inner pressure overnight, completely turned hostile. He slapped the waiter's delicate and white face and shouted abuse. The situation in the banquet hall suddenly became chaotic. As soon as the chaos appeared, it became calm. A large number of soldiers of Wulon State with live ammunition poured into the hall. The soldier at the front pulled the trigger against the ceiling. As soon as the gunshot sounded, the whole hall suddenly became quiet. The neat soldiers separated the crowd and moved forward. Finally, they guarded around the high platform in the center of the banquet. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State, who was tightly protected, walked up to the high platform and looked down. His eyes were dignified and solemn. He knocked on the microphone. Everyone, his voice echoed in the conference room. I'm here to announce bad news. About 3 hours ago, the war in most areas of Eastern Europe was over. In the extremely silent atmosphere, only Li Huaqing's voice sounded. Snow Country and their allies have won. Some people looked embarrassed, some were pale, some had dim eyes, and some looked panicked. They were the clan leaders of wealthy families all over Eastern Europe. Now the war in most areas of Eastern Europe had ended, and Snow Country had won. What about their families and foundations? The worst news is that we've got the exact information. This night, it's not just you who were attacked. Some wealthy families who didn't come to Reki City were also targeted by the coalition forces of Snow Country, such as this one. He raised his hand, and a photo that everyone was familiar with appeared on the screen of the banquet hall. Patriarch Clive, Li Huaqing said in a deep voice. His family is stronger than many of the families here, and it has never had any political inclination in the past. Zhongzhou State has no contact with the Clive family, but when the war broke out, the soldiers of Snow Country broke into the Clive family. 4 hours ago, Patriarch Clive surrendered and signed a series of property transfer agreements. 3.5 hours ago, Patriarch Clive was shot in his family headquarters. According to the current news, his beautiful wife and daughter have disappeared. A cold and stiff atmosphere suddenly broke out in the silence. F*CK. Damn it. These bastards. In the hustle and bustle, everyone had a feeling of sympathy. It was not difficult to imagine Clive's mood when he signed the family property transfer agreement. And it was not difficult to imagine the humiliation he would suffer after his wife and daughter were missing. Li Huaqing's voice was still calm. There are many such examples. I have no other meaning in saying this. I just want to tell you that there were many reasons for the situation to develop to this point. But the war last night had little to do with your choice to stand by Zhongzhou State. Snow Country launched the war because they wanted to establish a new order, that's all. I have issued an order through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Zhongzhou State, and given a warning to Snow Country. So everyone, you should feel lucky, because you are now friends, partners, and even your own people of Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State has the obligation to protect you. Snow Country and their allies want your industries. With the warning from Zhongzhou State first, before you fall into their hands, your families may be under house arrest or locked up, but at least they won't die mysteriously, and they won't suffer humiliation that they shouldn't have. All the patriarchs of the wealthy families in the banquet hall were silent. Everyone was looking at Li Huaqing with complicated eyes, but the atmosphere in the banquet hall was much better than before. At least the strength of Zhongzhou State was something that all the wealthy families could rest assured about. Li Huaqing casually waved his hand and said, "Everyone, the war is not over yet. I, the standing minister of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State, Marshal Dongqing Wudi, has now led tens of thousands of elites of the Black Dragon Army to penetrate hundreds of miles into the territory of Snow Country. It is estimated that Marshal Dongqing will reach Kamos in 24 hours. And the latest news is that Jia Delin is desperate. At present, he is personally leading 2 legions to Reki City. Snow Country is racing against time with Marshal Dongqing. You should all know what this means. Jia Delin wants to capture not only me but also the delegation I brought with me, because those hundreds of people are also important figures in Zhongzhou State. Similarly, he also wants to capture you alive. What I said is the truth, and I want to emphasize that from now on, I will not leave this hall. The war is going on. Everyone Zhongzhou State is taking the same risks as you. And the outcome of the war depends on the speed of Marshal Dongqing and Jia Delin, on the decisive battle in Mormons, and also on you. At this time, if you have any means that you haven't used, there is no need to hide them now. In a few hours, a dozen hours, I hope to still be here to celebrate our victory with you. At that time, the cake in front of us will be the whole of Eastern Europe. Heaven and hell had always been separated by only a thin line. This banquet had now become a complete gamble. The loser would lose all their possessions and their families. The winner would get endless benefits from all of Eastern Europe. Li Huaqing walked down the platform and said, "If anyone wants to quit or seek refuge in Snow Country at this time, you can leave. In the name of Zhongzhou State, I will not stop you." His figure walked to the lounge at the back of the banquet hall. The patriarchs of the wealthy families in the hall did not move. In the subtle silence, someone finally began to take out their mobile phones. The mobile phone signal had been restored. One call after another was made to all corners of Eastern Europe. The hidden means of the wealthy families began to ferment gradually. Behind the banquet hall was a row of corridors. There were boxes on both sides, which were lounges. It was also a place to talk about some major projects and cooperation. The soldiers escorting Li Huaqing stopped in front of the corridor. Li Huaqing walked to his lounge alone. His expression was still calm, but his eyes were full of solemnity. By now, the chaos in Eastern Europe was no longer a conflict in the Dark World, but a large-scale war involving the whole of Eastern Europe. Zhongzhou State had been completely involved. The winner would live, the loser would die, and the way to retreat had completely disappeared. At this time, he suddenly missed the Snowdance Corps, which had been frozen on the parade square by Wang Tianzong's sword. If the Snowdance Corps of more than 10,000 people could move freely at this time, the entire Reki city would have at least 100,000 more troops. What was there to fear about the two legions of Snow Country? Passing the corner, a clear and melodious laughter rang out. It was the laughter of a young girl, delicate, mellow, and carefree. Along with the girl's laughter, the middle-aged man bragged triumphantly, "Daughter, you don't know that I was standing at the gate of the group at that time." Merson and the leaders of several other consortia bent over and walked down the steps. They even wanted to shake hands with me. Ha 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 ha, it's a joke. Agreed? How could I agree? I wouldn't agree. The old guy, Merson, almost knelt down to me. Later, in less than 3 months, I directly bought nearly 70% of the 4 consortia's industries, and then sold them and made a lot of money. Li Huaqing was in a daze. He knew what the other party was talking about. However, at this time and in this kind of atmosphere, it was really inconceivable to hear such a conversation. How heartless must one be to brag here when war and artillery could come at any time? He passed the corner and turned his head to take a look. In his sight, Han Donglu, the boss of Zhongzhou State's Flourishing Age Fund, was standing in the corridor with his daughter, Han Xinyan, talking smugly about his past when he was young. Li Huaqing shook his head subconsciously. He knew what Han Donglu had just said. It was many years ago when the Flourishing Age Fund had just risen. At that time, Li Huaqing was still working in Liaodong. The so-called Merson was a financial tycoon in Eastern Europe many years ago, and also the most important stepping stone in the rise of the Flourishing Age Fund. The financial war between the newly rising Flourishing Age Fund and Merson's Angel Fund could be said to be really thrilling. Although there was no fighting, every detail was full of unconstrained intelligence. After the end of the war, the Flourishing Age Fund expanded into a real behemoth almost overnight. Today, that war was still regarded as an unsurpassable legend by the industry. He did have the capital to brag about this matter, not to mention that he was bragging to his own woman. It didn't matter if it was exaggerated. But the point was, didn't Boss Han feel that the occasion was wrong? Han Xinyan saw Li Huaqing's figure and pointed her white and tender finger at her father. Han Donglu leisurely turned around with a glass of red wine in his hand, and happened to see Li Huaqing shaking his head. He was slightly stunned, coughed dryly, and smiled awkwardly. "Mr. President, I'm sorry." "Don't mention it. What Boss Han just said is true. The battle between the Flourishing Age Fund and the Angel Fund has been used as a teaching material by all the major funds. If you want to talk about flattery, they are more exaggerated than you. Li Huaqing joked. Han Donglu laughed and was high-spirited. When his wealth reached such a level, he could really be regarded as rich as a country. In front of anyone, he could freely withdraw and release his wealth. Those people outside should have started to move, right? These wealthy families have been developing in Eastern Europe for many years. Now, although they have suffered setbacks on the surface, who knows how many secret means they have? They are the real local tyrants. The current war is just an opportunity for them to use all their secret means. If they hide it this time, the next time they take it out, it is estimated that they will deal with Zhongzhou state. Han Donglu shook his head, looked at Li Huaqing, and gave him a thumbs up. Good move, President. Li Huaqing narrowed his eyes and shook his head with a smile. I'm just telling the truth. There must be hidden dangers if these people are locked up here. In that case, it's better to tell them the truth and let them play by themselves. Maybe it will work. Anyway, I'm not lying. After removing the communication shield, they know what they should do. He paused, turned to look at Han Donglu and said thoughtfully, Boss Han, you don't seem to be worried at all. In such a chaotic situation, with Han Donglu's status, he should be the most worried one. In terms of wealth, Han Donglu could be said to have reached the peak. If Snow Country broke through Reki City before Dongqing Wudi, apart from Li Huaqing, Han Donglu could be said to be the most valuable target. If Snow Country could plunder all the wealth of the Flourishing Age Fund, it would be enough to make up for the internal turmoil of Snow Country after the loss of the Violet family. It could even make up for the loss of this war. Maybe it could also increase military expenses for a few years or even longer. Of course, at that time, Han Donglu and even Han Xinyan would also end up horribly. What are you worried about? Han Donglu was a little puzzled. The 2 legions of Snow Country are now on the way to Reki City. Jia Delin is leading them in person. Li Huaqing said calmly. Han Donglu nodded. Oh, 2 legions. His voice was casual and flat. The 2 legions led by Jia Delin were understated in his words, as if Li Huaqing had just said that he had eaten 2 eggs not long ago. They can't come over. What are you worried about? Han Donglu took out a cigarette and handed it to Li Huaqing. He sighed and said, It's a tragedy for Jia Delin. He wants to die, but he doesn't have the chance. Li Huaqing took the cigarette and was a little stunned. Why can't they come over? Because they have too few people. Han Donglu's tone was extremely calm. There are only 2 legions. Does Jia Delin think that he can compete with Marshal Dongqing by leading them in person? He shook his head. Are you kidding me? Han Xinyan took the room card and opened the door of the box. Han Donglu walked in, turned around and said with a smile, President, would you like to come in and have a seat? I have a bottle of good wine here. Li Huaqing was stunned for a moment and looked at Han Donglu. He really couldn't figure out where the other party's inexplicable confidence came from. The 2 legions of Snow Country had nearly 70,000 people. This was not a large number, but it was definitely not a small number. The base of the Arctic Ocean Command in Im was scattered at the beginning of the war. The entire Arctic Ocean Command was not prepared at the beginning. In addition, Commander Cheng Huaining had just taken office. In the command of the battle, although his orders were sound, they had changed. Now the entire Arctic Ocean Command was scattered. As for the 4 countries around Wulan State, Oga State and Ross State were in the direction of the March of Snow Country. These 2 countries were small countries. In the past, they advanced and retreated together with Wulan State. Moreover, Ross Oga and Wulan State had been severely ravaged by the Snowdance Corps. The armies of the 3 countries had suffered heavy losses. To put it bluntly, the only obstacle between Jia Delin and Reki City was not the troops along the way. There were almost no troops along the way. The only obstacle between the 2 was actually the distance. And every minute and every second, the distance was shortening. If not, Jia Delin would not be crazy enough to compete with Dongqing Wudi in speed. After all, a madman was not an idiot. Mr. President? Han Donglu stood outside the door and shouted again. Don't you want to come and sit down? No. Li Huaqing came to his senses, suppressed his inner doubts and smiled. I have something to do. Han Donglu nodded and closed the door. He turned around and found that his daughter was looking at him with great curiosity, and the look in her eyes was extremely strange. Han Donglu touched his face subconsciously. What's wrong? Old Han, are you really not worried? Han Xinyan was silent for a while, and then suddenly asked, the army of Snow Country is coming here. Aren't you also not worried? Han Donglu laughed. He walked to the computer and turned it on. He casually looked at the stock trend chart on the screen, picked up the mouse, and operated it in boredom. I'm not worried because of you, okay? Han Xinyan rolled her eyes and poured a cup of tea for Han Donglu. Han Donglu took the tea, took a sip, and shook his head subconsciously. Eastern Europe was different from Zhongzhou State. Because of the environment, tea could almost be regarded as a luxury. Even the so-called special tea provided by the Manlisai Hotel was too far from his taste. Han Xinyan propped her cheeks and looked at her father. Her quiet and beautiful face was filled with confusion. You are my father. You are here and you said that everything will be fine. Of course I won't worry, because you will be there to support me no matter what happens. I thought it was okay, but the president just had a lot on his mind. I could feel that he was also nervous. The patriarchs and big shots outside are all nervous and afraid. I don't look down on them, because I know that they are different from me. If something really happens, no one will support them. On the contrary, they have to support the people standing behind them. Old Han, you are the same, but why are you not worried and nervous? Han Donglu's hand holding the mouse paused, and then he said with a smile, as I said, because they have too few people, don't worry. But we have very few people too. Han Xinyan stared at her father. After a long silence she whispered, Dad, I'm a little scared. Han Donglu narrowed his eyes. An inexplicable emotion flashed through his eyes. In the extremely complicated chart, he reached out his hand and clicked the mouse twice casually. Then he touched his daughter's hair with the other hand. Don't worry, he said softly. It's okay. Han Xinyan ignored him. She stared blankly at the stock that Han Donglu had manipulated and muttered to herself. Old Han, are you really senile? You will lose money if you do this. What do you mean? Han Donglu was stunned. He took a deep look at his daughter and whispered, That's what I mean. He walked to the window with the teacup and opened it. Reki City, which had been disturbed by the wind and rain for several days, finally welcomed the sunshine. It was bright and warm, and the sky was clear. Han Donglu looked at the sky, and was silent for a long time. At this time, he was no longer the middle-aged uncle who laughed when bragging to his daughter. His thin figure stood in front of the window, with an incomparably deep power. A melodious chime came from the wall clock in the private room. Han Donglu looked down at his watch and muttered to himself, At this time, it's almost time to enter the market. When he walked into his own lounge, the secretary was answering the phone with a serious look. Li Huaqing sat on the sofa and waved his hand silently, motioning for the secretary to continue. He poured a cup of tea himself, leaned against the sofa, and closed his eyes to rest. The secretary quickly hung up. He quickly walked to Li Huaqing's side and whispered, President, it's a call from the Prime Minister. Li Huaqing sat up slightly. What did the Prime Minister say? The Prime Minister hopes that you can leave Reki City. He said that this is the common wish of all comrades. In addition, I also received calls from the old Minister Dongcheng, Minister Qi Baitsong, Headmaster Zhuang Huayang, and even some retired old comrades such as Senior Li. At this time, everyone thinks that you should leave Eastern Europe. The secretary's tone was extremely slow. Li Huaqing was silent and did not speak. The secretary looked at his face and said, In addition, Marshal Dongqing has called you 3 times to express the same meaning. Eastern Europe has currently blocked the airspace and sea area. But if you want to leave temporarily, the Arctic Ocean Command has a secret base in Eastern Europe. The military will arrange for you to leave temporarily. Li Huaqing glanced at him. With a smile in his eyes he asked, What do you think? The secretary hesitated for a moment. Just as he was about to speak, the phone suddenly rang again. He took out his mobile phone and looked at it, hesitating a little. It's Marshal Dongcheng. Oh, Li Huaqing said, waved his hand and said, Don't answer it first. Cut the video. The secretary nodded, hung up the phone, and went to operate the screen. A few minutes later, Dongqing Wudi's figure appeared on the screen in front of Li Huaqing, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, who almost overturned the entire southern part of Snow Country, was covered in blood. His face had been washed. After wiping it with a towel, he became clean again and even looked a little younger. But his eyes were full of solemnity. "President, I suggest you leave Reki City immediately." Without any courtesy, after saluting, he went straight to the point and said, "The secret base of the Arctic Ocean Command is about 400 miles away from Reki City. I will arrange reliable people. You can't go." Li Huaqing directly interrupted Dongqing Wudi's words. Dongqing Wudi froze for a moment, and then fell silent. After a long time he whispered, "A gentleman doesn't stand on a dangerous wall." "I'm not a gentleman," Li Huaqing said with a smile. "I'm the president of Zhongzhou State. No matter where I am, I represent Zhongzhou State. I'm invincible. In such a situation, what's the point of me leaving? Comrades will understand." Dongqing Wudi's voice was low. "They will understand, but no one will really understand." Li Huaqing whispered, "It may not be difficult to retreat, but if I leave, it will represent the compromise of Zhongzhou State. Not to mention whether the morale of the army will be affected. Even Wulon State will be in chaos in an instant. I can leave, but how can the people I brought leave? If these people fall into the hands of Snow Country, it will also be a disaster for Zhongzhou State. In fact, for Zhongzhou State, what's so important about me? The most important thing is the president. If I really die here, the Snow Empire will soon have a new president. Perhaps there will be chaos for a period of time, but as long as you defeat the Snow Empire, the chaos within the country will not cause too much waves." He looked at Dongqing Wudi and smiled. "Remember why I told you I was so satisfied with Tianlan? It's still the same now. He has always been the most satisfactory candidate for the state-protecting war god. Gu Xingyan will compromise and make concessions, but he is not strong enough. The Wang family of Beihai is tough enough, but in Wang Tianzong's heart, the Wang family of Beihai is more important than Zhongzhou State. Tianlan is different. He will never choose and he has no choice. So no matter what is ahead, he will rush forward. In fact, most of the time, everyone's situation is the same. Tianlan carries the Li family on his back and will not retreat. Behind you are tens of thousands of troops, and behind me is the whole Zhongzhou State. Standing at such a height, we can't compromise, and we can't afford to compromise. I will stand here." Li Huaqing was silent for a while and said firmly, "No matter what the outcome is, I must stand here, even if I die. Both at home and abroad, my successors will know that the president of Zhongzhou State is not a position that can be retreated or compromised." Dongqing Wudi did not speak for a long time. Li Huaqing suddenly laughed. In those days, the Li family's young highnesses swept across Eastern Europe and created the momentum of Eastern Europe. Now you and your precious son-in-law are also sweeping across Eastern Europe and creating momentum. It's so similar. In a few years, this may be another legend. Momentum. It's easy to get it, but it's even easier to lose it. But it's not easy for Zhongzhou State to have the current situation. If I retreat, Zhongzhou State's momentum in Eastern Europe will be gone, so needless to say. He looked at the screen and said word by word, "I won't retreat." Dongqing Wudi was completely silent. When Jia Delin was thinking about victory or defeat, in the face of such a situation, the president of Zhongzhou State was thinking about life and death. He would not die. Even if Snow Country really attacked Reki City, Jia Delin did not dare to kill Li Huaqing. But at this moment, the president of Zhongzhou State said word by word that he would die. What this meant was self-evident. Dongqing Wudi did not say much in the end. He silently hung up the phone. The screen went black. Li Huaqing leaned on the sofa, closed his eyes and hummed softly. In the temporarily modified carriage, looking at the darkened screen and Dongqing Wudi, all the high-level members of the Black Dragon Army did not speak. The army was rushing forward madly, like a torrent, like a huge wave, a raging tide, drowning everything. Dongqing Wudi's voice slowly sounded after a long silence. "Did you hear that?" No one spoke, but every high-level member of the Black Dragon Army straightened up. The president won't retreat. Dong Ching-Wudi slowly said. What should we do? All the high-level members took a step forward at the same time. Dong Ching-Wudi was expressionless. His face was tense, and every pore was full of killing intent and violence. Charge! The next second, in the mighty Black Dragon Army, everyone heard the almost crazy roar from the commander. Full speed ahead. Black Dragon Army charge. The mighty military truck ran fast on the road. Jia Delin sat in the spacious carriage, watching the army's marching route and the battle reports from all over, his face extremely cold. The spacious truck had now become the hub of the whole snow country. Countless pieces of important news were gathering in this place. Important news. And all of them were bad news. 5 hours ago, the Fifth Fleet of Snow Country was completely annihilated. 2 hours ago, the Black Dragon Army of Zhongzhou State broke through the city of Seine. An hour ago, Mormons. The 13th Corps was completely annihilated. Half an hour ago, Li Tianlan's motorcade officially entered the Mormons area. At the same time, the Purgatory God of Heaven Capital personally took action. The sword light was magnificent and illuminated the whole city. The elites of the Polar Ground Alliance suffered heavy losses. Countless pieces of bad news came one after another. And the only good news was from Jia Delin. The 7th Corps and the 14th Corps of Snow Country were extremely fast. In the full-speed charge, the army had run over Im and rushed into Ross State. Although the few remaining troops of Ross State resisted desperately, they were completely dispersed in a short time. Jia Delin did not even arrange for people to chase after the defeated soldiers. He and his army all focused their eyes in the direction of Reki City. Move forward, keep moving forward. The screen in the carriage was slightly separated. The video of Dong Ching-Wudi marching into Kamas appeared at the same time as Jia Delin marching into Reki City. Everyone who saw these two routes heaved a sigh of relief. The Arctic Ocean Command was broken up and temporarily unable to support. The military forces of Ross State and Oga State were extremely weak. At this moment, when Dong Ching-Wudi was less than 400 miles away from Kamas, Jia Delin's army was less than 200 kilometers away from Reki City. In the end, Snow Country won the war for time. Jia Delin's expression was still tense, but the people around him had already smiled. Mr. President, maybe we can get in touch with Reki City now. A major general staff officer came over, looking a little relaxed. Dong Ching-Wudi was less than 400 miles away from Kamas. In Kamas City, there were about 8,000 palace warriors and nearly 20,000 capital troops. Dong Ching-Wudi now had only a little more than 50,000 available elites. It would take time to defeat these two elites. This time was enough for Snow Country to completely crush Reki City. Contact, Jia Delin murmured. Yes, it's to practice them and negotiate. The staff officer was full of confidence. Zhongzhou State should have seen the situation clearly. According to our people's report, Li Huaqing has not left Reki City so far. Now Li Huaqing and the lives of countless big shots in Zhongzhou State are in our hands. We can kill them all, but I personally suggest that we cooperate with Zhongzhou State. President Jia Delin glanced at the staff officer coldly and did not speak. Now the situation in Mormons is not optimistic. We can pretend to cooperate with Zhongzhou State, transfer Dong Ching-Wudi's army to Mormons, and let them break the deadlock for us. Then we can secretly mobilize the army and complete the encirclement of Mormons. At that time, we can wipe out the Black Dragon Battalion, and even kill Dong Ching-Wudi. Jia Delin narrowed his eyes and did not speak. Indeed, they could not solve the problem even if they were faster than Dong Ching-Wudi. At most, they could relieve the pressure that Dong Ching-Wudi brought to Snow Country. But even if they caught Li Huaqing, the deadlock in Mormons was still in a stalemate. Even if they forced the Beihai Corps and Li Tianlan's motorcade, the battlefield would still be chaotic. At that time, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, Samsara Palace, and Snow Country would fight to the death. In fact, on the battlefield, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, the Beihai Corps, and the Samsara Palace were also fighting each other. The withdrawal of these two forces would only make the Samsara Palace and the Purgatory of Heaven Capital kill fewer targets. But if they cooperated with Zhongzhou State, Jia Delin frowned and felt a little disgusted. He instinctively disliked the word cooperation. The staff officer immediately understood. He smiled and said, "Cooperation may not be accurate. After all, the president of Zhongzhou State is in our hands. To be exact, we should coerce Zhongzhou State to cooperate with our actions." Jia Delin's brows loosened slightly. He thought for a moment and ordered, "Contact Dongqing Wudi." At this distance, everyone could be completely sure that Dongqing Wudi could no longer catch up with Jia Delin's speed. Even if he defeated Kamas, Li Huaqing and countless important figures of Zhongzhou State would also fall into Jia Delin's hands. At this time, Jia Delin really wanted to see Dongqing Wudi's expression. The god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, strong and iron-blooded, had been strong for most of his life. Therefore, in the current situation, Jia Delin very much hoped to see Dongqing Wudi bow his head and admit defeat. The staff officer personally arranged the call. The call rang and was immediately hung up. The staff officer was stunned and tried again. The call was ringing. Then he hung up. It was self-evident what it meant. The staff officer looked a little embarrassed and said hesitantly, "The other party refused to talk to us." Jia Delin snorted heavily. He thought for a moment and said, "Stop the car and let the soldiers rest in place for half an hour. Contact Wulan State. I want to talk to Li Huaqing." After all, Li Huaqing was not Dongqing Wudi. Therefore, the call was extremely smooth. In less than 5 minutes, the two presidents of the superpowers, who were less than 200 miles apart, had already seen each other through a screen. "Hello, President Li Huaqing." Jia Delin's expression was calm and indifferent. It was a completely confident posture. Li Huaqing smiled. "I'm curious." His voice was low. "At this time, our two countries are at war. I don't think it's necessary for us to talk." "I think it's enough," Jia Delin said calmly. "Your Excellency, I'm less than 200 miles away from Reki City now. Do you know what this means?" "I don't think you can come over." Li Huaqing thought for a moment and said calmly. Jia Delin sneered. "I can bet with you that within 3 hours, my army and I will enter Reki City. Your god of massacre said that he wanted to have tea with me in the palace of Snow Country. Maybe he can't realize his dream, but 3 hours later, I can have tea with you. Your Excellency, how do you feel?" Li Huaqing shrugged and did not speak. "You still have a choice now," Jia Delin said calmly. "Before I get to Reki City, you still have a lot of time to consider the cooperation between Zhongzhou State and Snow Country. As long as the Arctic Ocean Command withdraws from Eastern Europe, Zhongzhou State helps Snow Country win Mormons and returns the land that once belonged to Snow Country, including the Wang family of Beihai. My army can stop attacking when it arrives in Reki City." Li Huaqing said with some confusion. "The Arctic Ocean Command withdraws from Eastern Europe, helps you win all the interests in Eastern Europe, and returns the land, including the Wang family of Beihai." "Returns?" He laughed. "President Jia Delin, are you kidding?" Jia Delin laughed in a low voice. "Those who know me well know that I never joke. I don't mean that." Li Huaqing shook his head. "I mean, why do you dare to make such a condition? Since when does Snow Country deserve to make conditions with Zhongzhou State? With just your 2 legions? What a joke. With my 2 legions?" Jia Delin grinned grimly. "My 2 legions are enough to crush the dignity of the entire Zhongzhou State today." He glanced at the screen and said coldly, "Li Huaqing, there are still 60 kilometers left. Wait for me. Soon we will meet." Li Huaqing laughed, stood up, and said, "Bring it on." Before Jia Delin could speak, a sudden chaos suddenly came over. A large number of legions began to be in turmoil, and there was an uproar. Amidst the buzzing sound, everyone seemed to be shouting something in disbelief. Because everyone was talking, no one could hear the specific content. Jia Delin's face changed. He turned off the video and walked out of the carriage. The outside world was already in chaos. The soldiers who were temporarily reorganizing here were running chaotically in every corner, and everyone was passing on a message. Vaguely, the bad news finally reached Jia Delin's ears. Jia Delin's brain buzzed and became blank in an instant. In the afternoon of August 24th in Eastern Europe, On the battlefield of Mormons, the Arctic Army and the Bear Army, which had always been known as the pride of snow country, they were all wiped out. You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.